Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode or lesson of the Salon of Classical Architecture. We are now in our season three, talking about Islamic architecture, and we're going to go all the year round of 2026 talking about Islamic architecture. And as you very well know from previous days, the first part of the semester in the salon, we're going to be talking about Hispanic Islamic architecture. So we're going to be focusing on Spain and the West Maghreb. And from there on, we will be moving in the autumn and winter. We will move towards non like other manifestations. We will do a little bit of Persian, Ottoman, etc. The reason why we're covering more the Hispanic Islamic architecture is because that's the field that I know. But of course, if you would like to participate here, would like to give a lecture here, this is not my space, even if it sounds vintage, my space. This is for everyone to come and participate, and you know that you can always share and show your project, and we will have a critique. So let's start today. So today, as you know, we're going to have the typologies and then the usual question time and critique. So this we are in our second session of the third season, and we're going to be talking today about typologies in Islamic architecture. And I have divided this lecture into three sections. First one is the typologies of religious architecture, in which we're going to talk about the mosque, the minaret, even if the minaret is something close to the mosque, it deserves like a little space apart, and then the madrasa. Then we're going to talk about very quickly about the typologies in secular architecture, where the caravanserai, which I found very interesting to speak about. Palaces, we're going to talk briefly about the palaces, but I mean, it's so varied that it's just for you to know that obviously there are palaces in Islamic architecture, fortresses and urbanism, and then the garden. And then the last part, we're going to talk about the spaces, the political spaces in Spanish Muslim architecture, because this is something very important, that's very interesting, and it's like it sets a lot of architectural features in Spain that then are exported to the world through the revivals. So this is important because being the Hispanic Muslim architecture, or so-called Moorish architecture, one of the five pillars of the Orientalist revival, it has a very pivotal importance, especially considering that the amount of monuments they're limited but incredibly beautiful and interesting. So as opposed to other variations or the influences on the Orientalist revival, which are like a humongous amount of buildings and a big amount of buildings, in the case of Spain, it's very concentrated, but very well detailed, very well documented. So the first one we're going to start is with the mosque, of course. It's the most characteristic feature of Islamic architecture, the same way that would say that the most characteristic feature of European architecture or Christian architecture, if you want to say so, is obviously the church. So we have different types of mosques that have been adapted to the environment and to the characteristics of the local, which is something slightly different to what has happened with the churches, which have more or less kept all the elements intact wherever we are. However, there are several elements that are very important or are constant in every mosque, and those elements are usually the courtyard and the qibla or with the mirab. All the rest of the elements, we're going to see that they are optional, but you will always have a courtyard because you need to do ablution, you need to clean yourself before the praying, and then we need to have a qibla wall because all the prayers have to be oriented there, and the best way once you arrive to a mosque to know what the qibla is because of the mirab, which is a niche within the wall. Sometimes it's a niche within the wall, sometimes it's a whole decoration across the wall, but there is always something that very, very clearly when you arrive, you enter into a mosque, you know where you have to look at. Even if the mosque is heavily and lavishly decorated, there will be some part that is even more decorated or more prominent for you to see. So as we were talking 2 weeks ago, the origins of the mosque is the Prophet's house in Medina, where he was just gathering with his followers and they were just debating, discussing, praying. And as we were saying as well, this is the model of all the mosques. No? From there, you have what is called the mosque with the courtyard, and then it will go with the mosque, the centralized mosque, and then the 41 mosque. and on to the west it will go towards the courtyard and basilical mosque. So this mosque, I mean, I'm putting to the right, you have the typical house type that you could find in Arabia in the times of the Prophet, of Muhammad. So it's a very typical house. It's basically an enclosure where you would have all your camels or your horses or your not you might would have cattle, but you would have your flock of sheep or flock of goats. You would have it there, and then eventually you would add like a portico so that the animals and the goods would be protected from the sun, and then eventually you build it up. So it's just a gradual construction that you remember when we were looking at houses and floor plans and elevations in the other season of the salon, in the first one when we were talking about houses. That's where you find very similar examples. Some of you might remember, and if not, I encourage you to go back to that recording, those beautiful models of Egyptian houses where you can see the basically a very similar structure. So these are the parts, as we are saying. I mean, you know that very well what the different parts we were discussing them. But I mean, just for extra clearance, you have the praying hall in green, the residential part in orange, the shelter for meetings in purple, and then the massive courtyard and then several entrances because normally these houses had several entrances. So this is giving you a very basic idea of how they look. The mosque of the Prophet, the house of the Prophet, was extended over the years when it was converted into a mosque. And also you can see very clearly here, it's a bit orientation. We don't know if it was originally on purpose, but I mean, we had facing south of that house, facing Mecca, is where you have the hall, the hypostyle hall with the porches, and then to the north it was the different entrances. So when you remember that at some point Muhammad decides to change the direction of praying from Jerusalem to Mecca, it was just the chance, just by casualty, or also to ensure additional shading, because obviously if you have all your all your all your porticos, all your porches on this side of the courtyard, you will benefit from a lot of shading, because obviously the sun always is from it projects to the south, so you always have shades projecting to the north. So you have extra shading, extra freshness. So which again, I mean, is marking you the direction towards Mecca. And you remember as well from the last class that the direction of Mecca is fundamental in Islamic architecture because you need to pray facing Mecca. So this house was initially with palm trunks, uh, barely covered, just covered the minimum needed, the minimum standard needed to be built on that direction. But it will become the, I mean, I think that here there is like it's facing south. So in here we have the basics for all the mosques that will appear later. And here is like a bit of a more developed scheme, and also it's telling you how, by addition, this scheme evolves. No, you have like the hall on one side, but then you can surround the walls to create extra shading to move. Normally for shading, because obviously it's not going to rain much in Arabia, but when it rains, it rains, so you need to be protected, and then that's basically what the way it is organized. And then you know that very quickly after Muhammad's death, which by that time Arabia was already united, and then there is an expansion, and then there is a big conquest of a massive chunk of all the northern African possessions of the Byzantine Empire, plus the eastern part, and plus the total collapse of the Persian Empire. So the Umayyads settle. They need to admin, and they're settling in a massive empire that they need to admin. They settle in Damascus, and one of the first things they would do would be to transform the cathedral of Damascus into a mosque. And here you remember we were talking the other day in the sense that the direction of the church, reusing some of the pillars, etc. And then basically what we know from descriptions from ancient writers is that the cathedral of Damascus was inside a temple, or the courtyard or the cella of a Roman temple to Jupiter, and Temple of Jupiter was demolished, and then a cathedral was built on it. And then when the Umayyads arrived, they demolished the the cathedral, or the Riadat part of the cathedral, to build the mosque. And you can see clearly as well that, well, the cathedral had, it was based on the Roman basilica and organized to the, with the apse towards the east. The human just need to change completely the direction because they need to pray to Mecca, so they need to pray to the south. And again, they didn't choose this building for a reason. I mean, it was very, very easy for them because they had a massive, long wall to the south facing Mecca, which was easy to place the mirab. And I think probably because the way the basilica was built, we have a strange thing here that then they will try to solve later on in later mosques, which is the position of the columns. In this case, all the naves are running parallel to the Qibla, which means that once you are there, you don't see clear. You think that you feel that the direction is opposite, perpendicular to what the Qibla is. So that was a problem that they needed to deal with. But at the same time, people, when they're having researching, the archaeologists and architects think that the reason why they built this was, first of all, they used Christian builders who thought that that was the way to do because it was another temple. And also, B, that was probably the direction of the foundations and the direction of part of the foundation they were reusing from the Christian basilica. So that way we got that orientation that you were seeing pictures the other day. And here is an aerial picture of it. The minarets are later, but all this central part is basically, let me just mark it down, all this area, well, basically everything except in the minarets. So this is the remaining of the courtyard, but initially the Roman courtyard would have probably been something this side, and the Christian basilica would have been placed in this, more or less here, part of it being occupied by that. In that line, the direction of praying for Christians would be always east, while they had to completely change the orientation. And that obviously has some compositional typological challenges, but they still had a massive portion to reuse, which is the Roman walls and the whole entrance to the temple. On that regard, as we were saying, all the mosques will have a mirab, which is the direction where pointing you towards Mecca. And this element would vary over the time, would start being like a very simple niche, a very simple element to become more and more elaborated. As opposed to Christian churches where we can have altar pieces with icons, with paintings, with sculptures, in Islam, you cannot have a representation of anything, hardly plants. So anything, any live being, definitely not people, cannot be represented. So you cannot have like a massive element or decorative element, or you cannot have the prophet, you cannot have the family of the prophet or any of the caliphs. They cannot be portrayed. So then the only way to develop it was with geometrical motifs, which are abstraction of nature, or with architectural motifs. And the mirab will get more and more and more complex as you can see in the illustration there. They become as complex as the apses in Christian churches, even more complex, because normally it will be the only place where you can get a little bit more ornated. You don't need to enter into the mirab to pray. The mirab is basically as a marking point. And I'm bringing this one here. If you have been in Spain, southern Spain, in Cordoba, you probably have seen it. This is the mirab of the Mosque of Cordoba, nowadays cathedral, and it's there just to it's at the end of the whole hall. We will have a separated session to talk about the Mosque of Cordoba, but it's at the end of that wonderful hall with all the columns perpendicular to the Qibla. Now it's doing well, and you might remember, if you check our WhatsApp group, I was sharing the other day some pictures of, after all this rain that have been in Spain, there was those perpendicular walls to the Qibla. Basically, I mean, if you remember the video I shared, it was all the water being evacuated to the wall of the Qibla. And you can see a beautiful mosaics that were done by Byzantine artisans. And one of the reasons why everything is so extremely well preserved, of course, it has been restored. But it was also because very early in the Middle Ages, they installed a massive altar piece in there. and they only removed it at the end of 18th century. So then basically everything was as it was it was preserved perfectly for 400 years. So it was only the wear and tear that they had from the 8th century up to the 13th, 14th century. Another of the elements that you find in a mosque, especially in the mosque around Egypt and Syria, is very located in the Levant, is the minbar. The minbar is basically a pulpit. So obviously it doesn't look like the Christian pulpit, but it's a pulpit where one of the main imams or main clerics from the region would go and preach and have a little speech. I mean, it has the same system of the minar of the pulpit in the sense that it's like elevated to ensure that everything can hear you. It has like a cover top to ensure that the acoustic will expand in the sense that if you speak up and then if there is nothing on top, the sound waves disperse. Well, if you are having a top, the sound waves just clash and then are coming back. So it's ideal. And you have here a more modern example of a minbar in which case you can see here that this is closed. It has become a decorative feature, but originally it was that intention. Talking a little bit more of how the mosque evolved, we have two clear direction toward the east and toward the west. They will also have an impact on the direction of the Qibla because as you move to the west, the Qibla will be always pointing east and southeast. While when you go to the east, the Qibla will be pointing south west. And then obviously when you go below Mecca, the Qiblas will be pointing north. So you find some places around India and Indonesia, especially Indonesia, which has a very heavy Muslim country, you have mosques that are pointing northwest. Obviously, I mean, from a Spanish perspective, would be difficult to understand because obviously in Spain they look southeast, but it's just if you join the points, you are getting the same direction. And all these generic types, they just evolve into different types. And I have put here, I mean, I have downloaded this from the internet. Unfortunately, this is part of a presentation I did 16 years ago when I was invited to Notre Dame to give a series of lectures on Islamic architecture by Lucien Style, which I have always been very grateful for that opportunity. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I found them, and I have been trying to find them on the internet, and they have vanished, they have disappeared, all these schemes. So whoever did them have retired, have taken them out, and I have them because I saved them 16 years ago. So you can see that we have almost 3 to 4 types of mosques. No? We have like the courtyard mosques, which are all the purple ones, and which are basically a little bit of variations of the generic one. Then you have the cupola on the central base, which are inspired and derived from Byzantine architecture. We have been talking in the group about that. And then we have the brown and dark green ones, which are sort of special types that are a combination of both or are derivations, variations on each or other theme, especially dedicated with the idea of the 41 most, which we're going to see in a moment. And also, we will see, especially in India, you have mosques that don't have a hall. It's just a courtyard and the Qibla. So that's why I was saying it's a very special Qibla. It's a very architectural Qibla, we will see. But that's a bit the difference between what I was saying, that the two main elements is the Qibla and the courtyard. All the elements, you can remove them and you will still have a mosque. And then in Indonesia and in some parts of China, you remember when we were talking last week about how Islamic architecture mimetizes with the architecture of the territories that it has been settling, when in most of the cases, because the Islamic rulers were in an upper position, a position of power, they would just adapt the architecture of the territories that they have conquered to the new mosque. But when they go to China, which is a very well settled state, it's a very suspicious of exchange of foreign thing, very suspicious of anything that is not Chinese. They didn't like. They had to mimetize and adopt the the forms of Chinese architecture just to hide and to be more discreet. So on that sense, that's what we have, like all these three, four types, depending on how you consider. And you have like a transition type, which is the Persian, the 41, but not because it's a transition type means that it's less important, because obviously Persia was like a very powerful empire. And here you have a little bit of a description on the type of mosque that we have. We have starting to the left, and above we have like the typical mosque. If you live in the Middle East, that's the mosque that you have almost everywhere. You see any little neighborhood mosque looks like the one on the upper left corner. To the up to the right, we have the
Thank you.
we
It looks like it's perfect on the inside.
Sorry.
I'm going to very quickly that I'm going to mute all of you, and then remember, how can I mute? So I'm going to mute everyone. And then, yeah, so that's basically what I'm going to do. But remember, you can always unlock and unmute yourself if you want to talk. So basically, in the two images on the upper right corner, we have the another reconstruction of the house of the prophet, and then we have another evolution, which is the Mosque of Kufa, that is like a very much evolution of the first, or it's an extension of the prophet's house. No, you have the courtyard, and then you have the apostle hall in a very, you can call it vernacular way. And then from there on, we go to the one below, which is the Great Mosque of Kairouan, which is the first proper mosque built as such. It's not like the Mosque of Damascus, which was reusing a building. This is built ex professor, because Kairouan was a city founded by the Arabs. And then this settled the scheme for Western Europe and also West Africa. So you can see in here, this is typical. This is a mosque that you can find in Timbuktu, very typical on that regard. And then, as part of the evolution of the concept of the one, which we will talk about, that we have mosques like these two ones, in which you will have the sanctuary, the space to pray, but also they will be incorporated with other facilities for the mosque. Sometimes it's a madrasa, sometimes it's just like additional rooms, additional halls for praying, for debating, spaces for clerics, for women, and they will conform a courtyard with a double symmetry. And then we have in here the ones I'm going to mark in pink. This one and this one are like a combination of the typical mosque with the courtyard and something that the Ottomans, that first the Seljuks and then the Ottomans would incorporate, taken from Byzantine architecture, which in this case will be the dome. So the Byzantines, as we know very well, they were masters in building domes. So as the Ottomans, Seljuks and Ottomans would conquer more and more and more territories of the former Byzantine Empire, they would start to adopt or to adapt the forms of the Byzantine churches into their mosque. And then they would add their own variation of the minarets, which we will see. And then finally, in Asia, they would reuse the form that comes from the Buddhist and Confucianist architecture into that, because especially in China, they would be prosecuted. They still are prosecuted in China, the Uyghurs, and then they will have to design an architecture that just blends completely. It's not architecture that adapts the precedents to build something new. It's architecture that adopts completely as they are, and then they will just try to merge it. Let's go to the next slide. And here, I mean, coming back to the Mosque of Damascus, I like bringing this scheme. We're going to see it a lot this this season, but I wanted to bring it because you can very well see the structure of the arcades, how they are, in order to increase the height of the building, they need to reuse the Roman columns, but then they add another level of arches. This is very important for you to keep in mind, because later on, when the only surviving Umayyad flees to Cordoba and declares himself independent emir, he will ask the Spanish architects to build him something like the Mosque of Damascus. And obviously, back then, there was no way they could fly. They could just travel to Damascus. It was long and dangerous because they would be identified as supporters of Abdurrahman. And also, I mean, they didn't have a way of representing it. And if they were asking the client, I don't know, probably the Rahman may have a lot of skill, but I'm not sure if he was a good drafter, considering how difficult it was to draft back then. So the Spanish architect had to invent a bit the idea of the double arcades, and that's where they went with the idea of the Mosque of Cordoba. But anyway, what I want you to see here is just the direction. So the number 3 is or number 3 is where the Qibla is, and then I mean you see that the naves are parallel to the Qibla, therefore generating a little bit of confusion, because once you enter, you think that the naves are talking to you about the directionality. Moving forward, this is the Mosque of Kairouan, and as I was saying, in this case, we have completely a mosque built ex professo. You remember we were also talking, or we will talk about that in due course, that it is believed that the minaret is a sort of copy of the stage on how the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria was looking at that time. We know that the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria was built by the Ptolemies in the 2nd or 3rd century before Christ, and over the years, it's a very tall structure. It suffered several collapses, several earthquakes, and it is believed that by the time the Arabs conquered Alexandria, it was probably 2/3 to 1/2 of its original height, and reinforced and repaired to look something very similar to that. So they would build the minaret, and you know the story from last week, that apparently the legend said that when they conquered Alexandria, they just went on top of the lighthouse to call the faithful to pray, and they realized it was very effective, even more effective than the belfries. So that's why they decided to follow that way. And then you have also, in a very clear way, you have a little dome here indicating you where the mihrab is, and then you have another one creating an axis where you get the directionality. And here is the whole building. It's slightly skewed because apparently there were some problems with the setting out, so these things have always been happening, but you can very clearly see the naves are now perpendicular to the Qibla. We have an element here marking you, just if it wasn't clear enough, this is the Qibla, this is the mihrab, that the space will be called later on Maksura. And also, just as a composition, they have created here another cupola to generate the center. Another thing that you can see there is that the ceilings are flat. The roof is flat, which over the years, over the centuries, has always created massive problems with drainage, generating that the beams have to be replaced every so often because they get rotten. So this problem is something that obviously when Abdurrahman was fleeing from Damascus, he went to Kairouan. He could have seen it first line, and probably was something that he told his architects in Cordoba to solve. And we will see that when we get to the Mosque of Cordoba. And here also you can see very clearly, very well, the minaret and the axis and the whole directionality of the roof plus the orientation. And now we are moving as another example of all the mosques with hypostyle halls. And as I said, I'm focusing on these ones because they are the most abundant in Western Europe. They're basically the only model that you find in Western Europe, with the exception of some Ottoman-inspired or Byzantine-derived domes, and the kubbas, which we will see what they are, which is basically like a small oratory that is just covered in itself, doesn't have columns, doesn't have anything. So this is the Mosque of Cordoba as it was looking after the last extension in the 11th century. And basically, again, this is the model of any mosque built in Western Europe nowadays. Naves perpendicular to the Qibla, a massive space pointing out what the Qibla is, and another one in here, which it is believed that was marking the old mihrab, because the Mosque of Cordoba was done in 4 stages, and you can also as well, I'm going to draw them quickly. This is the first part of the mosque, in which it was just a square. Well, it was a little bit less. It was something like this, was a square. Then they did a second extension, which it is believed that this, even this is part of the other extension, it has something like this to mark the Qibla. That's why they kept all this importance in here. Then they did a third extension, where they also increased the size of the courtyard because the mosque was getting too big. And then finally, in the 11th century, they do the last extension. And we will see, I mean, there are some items that happen. I mean, you see all the columns are perfectly aligned. And then, I mean, they just kept some of the portions of the original wall just to cross out. And we will see that next week. But you see a little bit how all this works. This is a reconstruction of how it may have looked in the 11th century. What you can see, I mean, it's a bit, as initially, as I was saying, it was very symmetrical and very directional. And then when they did the last extension, it lost a little bit the balance. And it's something that you can still see in the building nowadays. We're now moving towards the Iranian, so-called 4E1 mosque, in which is basically, I mean, it's you have a little bit it's a mix of open mosque with a closed one. You have some areas that is for storage, for halls, for rooms. You have a big courtyard where you will also pray, and some other elements. So in this case, because we are to the east of Mecca, the Qibla is pointing to the west. And the reason why it's called Iwan, it's taking inspiration. These Iwans were based on previous architectural elements from the area. And in this case, I mean, I'm bringing here as a very clear reference is the so-called the Arch of Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon, this is an element built at the beginning of the Christian era. It's a massive, impressive arch built in brick. It's now been restored. It was much wider up until the 1880s, when apparently after a storm it just collapsed half of it. So we have pictures of this being much more covered. And this is supposed to be, they think that this was an open throne room. So the satrapa, the emperor of the Persians would be sitting there receiving the audiences, etc. While and then that's once all these cities, Sassanid cities, were conquered, the new Islamic rulers would probably adapt that idea. They would adopt those forms and then create the 41. So we don't know to which extent you had more construction like this, but it was probably popular enough so that they would be used later on. And then here is like a bit of the model with the 4+1. I mean, in this case, we also have like the idea of a domed mosque, because obviously the Persians as well were very masters of building domes, while in the rest of all Western Europe and Northern Africa, it will be more like bolts, simple barrel bolts, while the Persians and the Byzantines develop a little bit of a more interesting technique on building domes. And this is, I mean, you remember when we were showing the other day, this is a bit how it looks on the inside from the courtyard. And there you have the two massive ones, you have the minarets and the massive mukarnas that you see on the arch. And this arch is also pointed. And this is something that there is always a discussion on, oh, these guys, because this mosque is from 200 years before Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture was invented there, and then the Crusaders stole it, blah, 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 blah. The usual narrative. That's what I was telling you. Be careful with the book from this lady that got a bit too overexcited. These arches, they don't have a structural capacity. These arches are, I mean, obviously, they don't take to the maximum the capacities of Gothic architecture. So this is a pointed arch. It's not taking the advantage of creating a sort of a cross bolt and or a nerve dome or rib bolt, and that's why you have that. So you have the mukarnas, but these mukarnas are not structural; they're decorative. So you are losing, with this arch, you are not having all the structural capabilities of Gothic, and that's therefore why you cannot consider that they are precursor on any size of the Gothic, because the reason why Gothic develops from the 12th century onwards in Europe, it's basically because Romanesque architecture cannot provide what they were looking for. And this architecture doesn't provide either, because once you are inside, they are dark buildings that their systems are like massive domes, massive walls, massive barrel bolts, and not like the lightness of Gothic. And to close up the mosque part, this is one of the most popular or most well-known mosque in India. And this is what you see, this is what they were saying. I mean, this is just a courtyard and a qibla. In this case, the qibla itself, with the mihrab, is a much bigger building. We're not talking about just a niche. We're talking about a proper architectural feature. But the reason why it is that is because of the heavy, massive amount of population and also the heat. So you don't want to cover a building, go to pray 5 times a day, and the whole building full of stinky people. You just do it in the courtyard, and it's easier to move around. And that's basically the last typology that you find on proper Islamic architecture. The other two, one, China and Indonesia, would be proper adaptations of local architecture, conversions of local architecture into mosque, and therefore they continued in China as they were, as a hiding within local architecture, and in Indonesia, the moment that the Islam became majority, they would stop doing mosque on that sort of Buddhist style, and they would move toward more Mughal and Ottoman influences. And the last part that they were saying is the domed mosque that you find in Anatolia, that starts with sort of hall, hypostyle hall, basilical hall, covered with different type of vaults. But then very quickly, especially once Constantinople is conquered, it would become just basically copies of Hagia Sophia with a courtyard, which you also find in Byzantine architecture, in this case called the narthex. So you have all the elements that you need. Is basically converting Byzantine architecture into Islamic one, which is what Sinan did, and then from there it became one of the pillars of the Orientalist revival, which was Moorish architecture with Alhambra, Egyptian architecture with the expedition to Egypt by Napoleon, Persian architecture with the description of Persia by French, Pierre Launay and Pietro Montani, Ottoman architecture, and then Indian architecture, which evolved in a different way because the British never did proper surveys until end of 19th century when they did the Jaipur portfolio. So it was, and then it was mixed Mughal and Hindu. It had a different approach at architecture, but actually nowadays the Mughal architecture is one of the strongest one in getting an influence. Why? Because it's less severe than the Persian, and it's more playful, so people like it more for a revival than a proper Persian or Egyptian revival, which is a bit more austere on that sense, or the Spanish one, which has been so overly used that people don't like it because it has been heavily overly used. Well, moving towards now the other element, which are the minarets. So the minarets, as we say, I mean, they start as soon as they start arriving to Christian Syria. They see the belfries, they say, okay, this is a way. We don't need to go to the rooftop. The taller we go, the easier, the farther we get into people. So there would be several types of minarets, and you have the first one is more the initial Syrian minaret. The second one is more the Middle East or the Persian Gulf and an Indian minaret. The third one is inspired in the light of Alexandria, which is the proper Moorish minaret. And then you have the Ottoman minaret, which is very tall and thin. So, and all of them, I mean, they will just develop their own things. And obviously, in all of them, there is a staircase that takes you to a platform very up, and then you stay there. And then, in many cases, the people will stay the whole day there, or even live there in a little cubicle. And this shouldn't surprise us because in late antiquity and early Middle Ages, especially in the East, in the Levant, there were some people who were the Estilites. The Estilites were called so because they were on top of a stylus, on top of a stick, on top of a column, and they were developing all their lives on top of that column. They were just doing, in this case, it was praying and doing penitency on top of that. On top of that, but for example, as well, up until early 20th century, there were people living inside the belfry of the Cathedral of Sevilla, of La Giralda, and there was also a very well-known nun, which became a saint, and she was called the daughter of Giralda, because she was born there and they were living there. And still nowadays, when you go to the Giralda, you can see the cubicles that were initially cubicles for storage done by the Muslims, but then they were converted later on the houses of the people who were just ringing the bells. And as I said, coming to Spain, the most prominent minaret is the minaret of the Giralda, of the previous former mosque of Sevilla. But this is the culmination of a tradition of minarets that starts in the Mosque of Cordoba, that goes to the Mosque of Hassan in Rabat and the Mosque of Kutubiyya in Marrakesh, and then goes to Sevilla, where they do the most perfect one, which is that minaret or belfry nowadays. But also, we know, because an architect called Felix Hernandez studied them, is that the proportions of the Mosque of Cordoba were that easy to achieve. They are based on 1:3, 1:6, and the setting of the arches was so powerful that all the churches in the Catalonian Pyrenees follow the same proportions as the minaret in the Mosque of Cordoba. I mean, those belfries follow similar proportion to that in the Mosque of Cordoba, which means that obviously the builders, that sometimes it is thought that they were Italian builders just moving around. This theory of Felix Hernandez is telling us that the builders didn't come from Italy, the builders came from Spain, or at least a mix of Italian and Spanish, because you cannot deny the Italian influences either. So it's very, very interesting. It's either A, they came from Italy and they just figured out and just by chance created the same, or B, there was something more in between. So this is another view of the Giralda, which I wanted to bring here so that you see all, and we will see that when we see the almohads. But all these panels, which are called sekba, they would become very, very popular again in Moorish architecture. And you see as well in Persian architecture, but they're not called sekba because the sekba is brick creating some three-dimensional effect. You see that in Alhambra made in plaster, but in Persia they would be more like flat with tile. So they enter more into the category of a spandrel, while this is more like a sekba panel. Sekba is always made with brick. And then finally, as we were saying, with the Ottomans, the minarets just change completely and they become like these pointed, uh, pointed elements, very thin and very tall, almost looking like a spike put there, which also creates a very stylized version of it. And it's like it's probably the only properly Muslim addition added to the Ottoman architecture, because all the rest, all the other elements, when you see them, this is Byzantine architecture. This is another version of Hagia Sophia, as there were many, many other churches in the Byzantine Empire, which were like variations of Hagia Sophia. And just to finalize this part on the religious typologies, we're going to talk about the madrasa, which is basically a religious university, and normally they would take the shape of the 41 type on the Levant and Persia. And in the West, in the Maghreb and Spain, they would take a shape more like a courtyard house. They will be indistinguishable from courtyard houses. Madrasas,
Pesta huutamari leidsayem.
please remember to unmute. So yeah, that's basically what the madrasas are. I mean, they would keep evolving, but they would become they are the sort of universities, and then because they're usually attached to a mosque, they would be probably part. All these dependents on the 41 mosques are part of the madrasa, all those halls where people would be learning. That is another type, as I was saying, that it's more into the courtyard house, the typical model of the Mediterranean courtyard house. And we're going to see more models on that once we enter into secular architecture. First, we're going to see the palaces. And the palaces are interesting because obviously when the Umayyads go to Syria, they stop being just a very powerful nomadic warlord. They are a proper ruler. They are the caliph. And caliph is still being not only the religious leader of the nomad community, it's also the administrative leader of an empire that now needs to talk about taxes, need to talk about water rights, need to talk about land rights. And all that comes with a lot of wealth that they didn't have in Arabia. And that comes as well with the wealth on which the Byzantine rulers and the Sassanid rulers were living. So it was very easy for those Umayyads to transition into A, reuse the palaces of the people whom they have defeated, or B, build new ones. So all the area in Jordania and Syria, they would become populated with all these palaces for the royal family of the Umayyads, and then later on used a little bit by the Abbasids. These palaces are derived both from Roman military models, but also from palaces of the late Roman villas, which they were somehow little military posts because the Roman villas of the late Roman Empire, or the final centuries of the Roman Empire, they become heavily fortified because they had to protect themselves. They wouldn't be the Roman army would be too busy on the borderlines to protect the landowners, the landed gentry of the Roman Empire against like thieves and local bands. So that was the Umayyad palaces. And something that is important, I mean, I'm bringing this one in Syria because all the elements that you see there, this is classical architecture. This is late antiquity architecture. This is not something as completely different as, for example, the most of Damascus, which is 100 years later, of these palaces are. And why? Because the architects that they could find, they were Byzantines. The architects would be Christians, and they would be late antiquity, heavily inspired in the classical tradition, which they still mastered. So that's why all these Umayyad palaces, the Citadel of Amman as well, they are wonderful examples of, it's almost Byzantine architecture. It's late antiquity architecture. That's why many times you may have heard me saying that the Mosque of Cordoba is a building from late antiquity. Is more a late antiquity building than a medieval building. Even if it doesn't look at all like a classical building, there is much more classicism in the Mosque of Cordoba than, for example, in the Cathedral of Santiago, which are the first stages are more or less coinciding with the last stages of the Mosque of Cordoba. Or there is more classical architecture in the Mosque of Cordoba than in Cluny. Cluny, which is the maximum of the Romanesque church, is a completely different approach, properly medieval, properly adapted to a Christian mentality, while the Mosque of Cordoba is something completely different. Another idea of palaces. I don't know what's going. I'm going to mute all of you. So if you want to speak, I don't know what's going on. I mean, the muting is out. So if you want to speak, just unmute yourself. Coming back, obviously, when we come back to Spain, the Umayyads find a similar situation. No? We have the Visigoth nobility, which is very wealthy. It's living in one of the wealthiest countries of the former Roman Empire, which was Spain, very well developed, lots of Roman infrastructure, good climate, good land, lots of wealth. So there would be palaces, a lot of palaces built in Islamic Spain. The most prominent of those ones, I normally said that the first and the last they built, which is Medina al Sahara, which is a Palatine city, which is, you would say, the Versailles of Cordoba, of Umayyad Cordoba. And then you have the Alhambra of Granada, which is like a fortress converted into a palace. So while Medina Sahara is a palace built for pleasure, a proper palace, the Alhambra means a red fortress. The Alhambra is a fortress that wants to stop being useful because of the territory having been pacified. It is transformed into a palace, and we will see that when we talk about the Alhambra. We'll have one class only for the Alhambra. This is the planning of the whole palace of Medina Sahara. We know all that because with the aerial photographs you can check all the elements. And we can see a planification of this palace. This is not a random place. Everything is very well ordered and structured into little squares, very much like Roman urbanism. And we're going to see some examples, very interesting one. Obviously, the direction that you have here is following the terrain, but we have a different orientation here. I'm going to put it, let's see, in which color, pink. In here, which is the position of the mosque. Ironically enough, this is one of the best oriented mosques in Spain, because we will see that when we see the Mosque of Cordoba, the Mosque of Cordoba doesn't point southeast, it's pointing very, very south. This is for two reasons. There is one very practical reason, which is the geography, the terrain There is a cliff to the south. If you want to build close to the cliff, you need to build perpendicular to the cliff. You cannot build like rotated from the cliff because you will require more material. And second, it is because with the knowledge of the time and also to differentiate from the Abbasids, as Abdurrahman came from the south, it is believed that the mosque is oriented from the south because it's where he was coming from, and it was a sort of mistake from his side, thinking that Mecca was oriented there. Why as well? Because also the most of Damascus was oriented to the south, proper south. So that's probably why Abdurrahman wanted to mark that as his as a sort of a statement. And this is important because most of the mosques in Spain will follow the orientation of the mosque of Cordoba, except in two: the mosque in Medina Sahara and the oratory and a small oratory in Alhambra. So that the only two ones that are properly oriented. Palaces in Spain, I mean, because this is just like a little sneak peek. They would be changing. So from as you know that the caliphate collapsed in the year 1033 into small kingdoms, and then each kingdom would have its own palace. We have the Aljafería in Zaragoza, which we will see in due course. We have the massive Alcázar in Sevilla. We have several Alcázar. We have Alcázar in Toledo, in Segovia, in Guadalajara, in Murcia. All the bigger cities had a big Alcázar, or at least what it is called the Alcazaba, which is the castle itself. So the Alcázar of Sevilla wouldn't be at least a difference. And obviously, it is very important because it's one of the best preserved Islamic palaces in Spain. It's the oldest royal palace still in use in Europe. So, meaning that it has been continuously used. It's not the oldest, there are much older royal palaces, but they're not in ruins or they're not anymore royal palaces. So, the royal palace in Spain is the Alcázar in Spain is the oldest royal palace in Europe, still in use, which is something remarkable to consider. And of course, we need to talk about Alhambra as for those of you who are not Spanish, the Alhambra would be for you all the presume of Islamic architecture in Spain, but that there is much more than Alhambra. Alhambra is the end of a very long route that we're going to see, and it's the ultimate evolution of all the typologies that we're going to see in a moment as well. And this is what I was saying. I mean, there will be certain typology that will be repeating, and they will be connected to that. As a very small side note, we are going to talk about the caravanserais, which is basically like a commercial outpost destined to stop, to create the stops for the caravans. It's not much. Would be the caravans that would be also, especially the caravans that would go to the Silk Route, more rather than the caravans that would still cross Saudi Arabia, which already had a network on which to rely. The caravanserais are a Central Asia and Turkish creation, but again, it's like exporting the Mediterranean courtyard house towards the Mediterranean across Asia, up until the point in which the Chinese would have their own organization. Courtyard again, the courtyard is very important to control the caravans, but all this part of Central Asia that which wasn't ruled by China, neither by the Mongols, basically not ruled by anyone, would require all these because they would be paid by the merchants or sometimes the local rulers to create a refuge for them. And now we are going to jump onto urban organization. We were talking a little bit the other week about this idea that urban fabric in Islamic architecture doesn't exist. It's just chaotic. But that's not true. We saw Baghdad, and I wanted to bring you here this one. If you see this one, you think that I am showing you a Roman city. This could perfectly be the Palace of Diocletian in Split, in Croatia. But no, this is a city. This is the city of Arjan in Jordania, founded by one of the caliphs as his own palatial city. And the important thing of this is that all the elements, in this case, they are heavy evocation of Roman architecture. And it also has its own baths, as you can see in the upper part. So, and there is an area for a forum, and there is very, very interesting. And you have your Cardus, you have the Cumanus, the Tetrapilon, as you have in many Roman cities. So it's very, very interesting that, as we said, they completely adopted and adapted the architecture of the Romans to their own purposes. And as a properly genuine Arab creation, we were mentioning the other day, is the round city of Baghdad with several rings for different type of public servants or courtiers and commoners. But this city, however it might have looked, it was completely destroyed by the Mongols, and there is no trace of it, unfortunately. So we don't know if we're talking about existing or non-existing place. And then as part of that is the sort of Kashba or Al-Kasaba or Kasar, Al-Kasar organization, which is more chaotic, which more, some would call it organic. Camilo said they would be happy in a sort of these Kashba types, but basically they would be normally be in very well protected areas. They won't be in like Arjan or many other or Baghdad, which are like in a plain, in a perfect river, etc. They would be in a covered area. They would be in a more complicated area to access, easy to defend. And what you see here is a sort of ideal recreation of how the Alhambra looked like when it was in the transition between being a fortress and being a palace. So this is a little bit of that transition. And you can see that there are like even in this area, here you can see there are some orchards, some farms, and this is because all these areas, they had their own farms and orchards to ensure that you would be having some food supply in case of a siege. So all those things were very important to be considered. And this is more what we all imagine that the Islamic city looks like. No, it's like all this complicated network cluster of streets, and then that, yeah, they would be close or not to a river, normally because of all the security of the Middle Ages and the Arabs also coming from a nomadic culture that needed a lot of protection. They would tend to stay in elevated places, easy to defend, easy to protect, where you could control the territory rather than being in the middle of the plain. Yeah, it's the best place to be, but the best place to be attacked. So that's something that the Arabs would being themselves the one who were attacking and conquering all the territories of the former Byzantine Empire and Roman Empire. They would be very keen on abandoning all those cities and moving towards top of hills and easily to defend areas so that to prevent others to do the same thing that they did. So they were good strategists on that regard. As also happened in the Christian Middle Ages, and it also happened as well in Roman times, that would be a big differentiation of areas of the city. And I mean, this is something that nowadays it's difficult to understand. I mean, a lot of people criticize the zoning, blah blah blah. But if you're having tanneries, the tanneries are stinky. The water that you use cannot be used elsewhere. They're toxic. So you needed to have people separated areas to do different activities. And also this would ensure that the guild hall would control all the members. So still nowadays, especially in many cities, you have the street, the shoemaker street, the tailor street, and things like that, referring to the old jobs, offices that were done in there. And a big part, I would say, that if the mosque and the madrasa are the sort of enclosed public spaces, the souk, the market, would be the big public space. And the souk could be anything, could be from a square inherited from the sort of Roman Forum or Roman market squares, or just a hole in the city, an empty space in the city dedicated to the market, or a cluster of streets. So if you have been in many places in the Middle East, they have the souk. I mean, thinking comes to my mind the souk in Doha, which is like it is open or semi-covered, and then eventually those countries which a lot of sun, which you need a lot of shades, or b with a lot of power, like Iran and the Ottoman Empire, they would start covering the streets, the traditional streets where the souk was, or building dedicated structures for the souk, so as a way of controlling more trade and the taxes. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the court and the garden, which are two big elements of Islamic architecture. everywhere. And the reason is because the courtyard, first of all, is an element that you find everywhere. You need a courtyard for ventilation, for privacy, for sun, to increase the amount of sun that comes to your house, etc. Especially in a context where you don't want to open much to the exterior of the street. You need the courtyard. So the Arabs would also continue that trend, but that scheme of using the courtyard as the public space of the house, even the public space of the city, as soon as the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of the Roman elites would take out the governing of the cities and the maintenance of the cities, the public spaces became unsafe, become unusable, so people would turn back to the courtyard for that. But also the garden is very important in Islamic architecture because it represents the paradise. You know, I mean, if we go back to the Bible, when God creates the Eden, he puts a fountain in the center with 4 rivers. And that's basically what you have in every Islamic garden. You have the fountain and the 4 rivers recreating the paradise. So we are not only in a space that is to show beauty, it's a space with a tremendous religious significance, even as much as you could find in the Christian cloisters, which were also done as a sort of rememoration of the Garden of Eden, with the added thing that because the Muslims, the original Arabs, they didn't have much water because they were nomadic tribes in the desert. Once they arrived to the areas which were still keeping up with a good, well-maintained Roman infrastructure, as it would be North Africa and Spain, they would become crazy with the water. They would become obsessed with using water because we are not talking only about a symbol, we're also talking about the practicality of using a lot of water. And this will evolve into courtyards as the courtyard of the maids in the Patio de las Doncellas in the Royal Alcazar of Sevilla, which we will talk in due course, in which in this case it's like a slightly recessed, a slightly sunken garden to ensure extra dampness of the grounds. The gardens in Medina Sahara, being a palatial city, it was a very important thing to have and to consider within the city. We don't know, we know very little about how the original gardens look like, but there is still hope to find how. And also, I mean, see here in Medina Sahara, we will talk much about that. You see that we have like a double ledger of the garden, and then we have a pavilion, we have an interaction of several spaces. So this is not just a place with plants and flowers. So we are talking about a proper garden and landscape design done ex professo. And here is the other section through the side. You see that you are elevated, it's created like a hill with the 4 channels. It's like a very important space created on that sense. And with this, we finish the first part of the class. And before I start into the second part, I'm going to read the comments and see if any of you have any questions. So now is your time to ask the questions. So let's see what we have around here. So hello, 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 and that's it. So south, etc. So does anyone have a question, or shall we move towards the next stage? Remember, if you cannot speak, write in the chat. And if you want to speak, probably you will have to mute yourself because I have muted all of you. No questions? No? Okay. Well, let's continue. So what we're going to talk now, we're going to talk about 4 primary elements, primary spatial elements that you find in Islamic architecture in Spain. So they are originally from Hispanic Islamic architecture, although there is one that is universal, which is the Cuba. But all the elements that were developed in Spain, we will see them again and again during this first half of the year. But I wanted to reinforce because I will be talking about the basilical hall, the elongated hall, the Cuba, the lantern room. So we will have all those typologies. They were created. I mean, they were not created as such. Some of them, you find them in previous architecture. The Cuba is a small sanctuary, a small shrine that has always been there. The elongated hall with lateral alcoves is an element that it was before you find them in Roman ruins in the Spain, and the basilical hall. It name says everything. It's a basilica. So a lot of these elements were already there, and they were developing from previous structures that then just get adapted and repurposed. So the first one, I mean, and obviously this typological space, as you can see, it also giving us a beautiful amount of space distributions and structural possibilities that we will be talking. These are the different bolts that you can find in the Maxura of the Mosques of Cordoba. And all these, it's things that we will be talking in due course when we start, when we'll be dealing with the Mosques of Cordoba and other buildings. And we will see, I mean, this is a very lightweight structure because these are arches connecting all the points built in brick. The mortar is very it's a gypsum mortar that dries very quickly, and then they're covered with bricks as well, with gypsum mortar, so that the whole structure can be built very quickly. It's very resistant, especially if you're not going to do anything on top, and very, very effective. Has been there for 1,300 years, for 1,300 years, hasn't collapsed. I think it's a good idea. So, and this creates an evolution that also once it goes to the Christian kingdoms, it evolves in its own because it will start taking things from Gothic. So then, well, this architecture that when the Christians were reconquering the cities, they would arrive to an architecture that was like a derivation of that late antiquity and continued on that direction, almost like like and like how to say that, like narrowing themselves from only a single direction. When the Christians arrived, they said, "Oh, we can use this for Gothic," and then that would give a space to the Mudéjar, which is like the best of both. And as well, I mean, because of the historic relationship that has been like backwards and forwards with Moroccan architecture, with the Almohads, the Almoravids, and the Almoravid and the Benimir and the Marinids, because once the caliphate collapses and Spain becomes divided into small kingdoms, all these small kingdoms would be very indulgent and would be perceived as corrupt by the elites in northern Morocco. So they would invade the peninsula and reconquer them to incorporate into the empire, and that happened twice. First of all with the Almohads, then the Almohads collapse. Then there is another split into small kingdoms, and then become the Almoravid. No, it was first the Almoravids, then the Almohads. And then after the Almohads collapsed, everything is divided into small kingdoms again. And then the Marinids do a third intervention, and then by the time the Marinids settled, the only remaining part was the kingdom of Granada, and then they went from Marinids to Nasrids. They became the Nasrids. So that's a bit the whole thing in a nutshell. We will see more of that in the next course. So the first space that we have to consider is the Kuba, and the Kuba is like in religious architecture is like a small shrine, but in civil architecture it will become like a hall of honor or a space to receive ambassadors. It would usually be like heavily lavishly decorated room because it was like the show of room. It was like the room where the ruler would receive the ambassadors and the people. So it was usually a very lavishly decorated room. They would always try to have the most stunningly interesting structure display would be done would be in a Cuba, and that would also make an impulse to the development of architecture. It comes in different shapes. So this one that we are seeing here, this is an Alcazar of Sevilla, around 13th, 14th century. This is an Nasrid Cuba in Alhambra. You can see the Fountain of the Lions there. And this is a much later evolution, end of 14th century, beginning of 15th century. And that's something that when we see Alhambra, you will realize that because the Alhambra is the end, the final point on the evolution on Islamic architecture, everything is like multiplied in Alhambra. The Mukarnas have more Mukarnas. The elongated hall with alcoves has more elongated halls within alcoves, etc., etc., etc. So it's very, very lavish architecture. This image that you see here is the church of Cristo de la Luz. or also called Mosque of Cristo de la Luz, because it was a former mosque, then converted into a church. And so they added an apse to these sites and then converted into a church, but the oratory space was kept there. So this is a proper kuba in that sense. No, it's a kuba is like a cube, no, and the word alcove comes from there, from al kuba, the cube. This is how it looks on the outside. Very simple architecture made in brick, very effective. I mean, this is we talk many times about how important it is to create ornament with brick. And this is the kuba. The kuba it will always be combined with other elements. For example, before or after a basilical hall, before or after the elongated hall, before or after the other rooms. Because, for example, the elongated hall with side alcoves is like a long hall with two kubas either side. And when we will see the Nashville lantern room, is basically a kuba with light coming from above. But this is a different typology, very old typology that didn't survive much the collapse of the caliphate, which is the basilical hall. And basically, this is the reception room, the thrones room in Medinat al-Sahara, called the rich room, Salon Rico, or Salon de Abderrahman III in Medina Sahara. And it's basically, as you can very clearly see, it's a basilica. It's a Roman basilica. And this probably it's recuperating a very ancient tradition that was existing both in Spain, North Africa. It comes from the Roman Empire. The basilica as the place to impart justice, the place to dictate justice, to create agreements, a place of authoritas, a place of authority, a place where the image of the emperor would be placed in the basilica as like he was signing all the treaties, all the documents. So the basilical hall will become something very well related to palaces. We have very little. We have Medina Sahara. We have some of them in the Alcazaba, in the Aljaferia in Zaragoza. But then all the other later palaces, they follow a different system. But this is the effect. It's very, it's if I don't tell you what this is, you might even think that this is a church. But no, this is a palace. So it's very interesting for you to understand this idea of creating like the basilical hall with the perpendicular walls, a very similar system to what was used in the different mosques. There's another view towards perpendicular, so you can see that, yeah, the directionality is very clear on which side everything goes. This is another basilical hall within the city of Medina Sahara. This is called Military Hall. And we know these names because we keep some descriptions of the city while it was still in use as the Palatine Court. And we know that was called Dar al-Jund, or military room, the same way that the other room was the Rahman's third room, or the rich salon, or Dar al-Mulk. So that was the name that it had. But again, I mean, you can see here, this is from the back of the building towards the entrance, and you can see very well again the scheme. The difference with the rich hall is that here we're having a mix of walls and columns, while in the other one we had columns. But this distribution is very important, will appear later on in many elements of Islamic architecture. So this is a section through the hall, through the Dar al-Jund. And we're going to see another example in which we are having a combination of many elements, because this is a basilical hall that is a courtyard. And it is believed that probably initially there was a proper basilical hall where the courtyard is. So this is the section, this is a kuba that has a basilical hall after it. And that basilical hall has also another element, which is the elongated hall with side alcove. So it's all the elements combined in one. That's what I am bringing it, even we haven't spoken yet about that. But the courtyard here acts as a basilical hall. We don't know if it was probably because there are foundations here and here. So maybe there was more structure, and then it was like converted into the basilical hall attached to the Cuba, which in this case this is still called Salón del Trono. This is still considered a throne room. And then you have also the beautiful idea of having the fountain in the center, in here, and then giving you water to the courtyard. which is also, again, it is all this thing of the four rivers of the Aden, in this case, the Oliver River to the Aden, pouring to the sea, etc. So it's a lot of metaphors related to the water that we see quite a lot. Here is the section. You can see the transition of the spaces, and also how what we saw here in the Dar al-Junt of this tripartite division of three arches. So you have a tripartite division with the side divided into three. As Dr. Bura says, everything is divided into three parts. So there's always a three. Remember, three is a very important number for all the European culture. I would say even the Indo-European culture, three is massive important. So then here we see how all this concept of the side facade of the basilical hall are converted into a courtyard facade that is acting as an open basilical hall. So it's like lagering over lagering over lagering. And this is how it looks now. So you can trace an analogy between what you see in the Dar al-Junt and what you see in this courtyard. So there is this evolution, and that is what connects everything. There is only a couple of hundred years, less than a couple of hundred years, difference between the Dar al-Junt and this room, because it's the oldest part of the Alcazar, doing soon after the collapse of the Caliphate. So it's very, very interesting on that regard, how the typology continues, evolves, and creates something new. And we will see that as well in the Mosque of Cordoba, how many decisions that had to be taken in the Mosque of Cordoba out of necessity, they have become features. And we will see all these things of the arches, the aqueduct, etc., how that was done out of need, out of a value engineering thing, but then it became a feature of Islamic architecture. But also all these basilical hall, all these elements, they're also based on, we have let's say a national substrate of what Abderrahman and the Arabs found when they conquered Spain from the Visigoth and late Roman architecture. There was a substrate there that you cannot deny, but also they were having their own substrate in Syria, and this is the Mosque of Rusafa. So they built a mosque reusing elements from churches, and in this case we see the same tripartite configuration. We see three columns, a central opening, three columns, and a central opening. So Abderrahman saw all that in his youth. So when he went to Spain, he could ask for all that and could be easily understood by the locals because there was a similar tradition there. So this is why it is important for you to understand it's not only the basilical hall, it's also the distribution of the columns within the basilical hall that is creating you the feature. And here you can see that idea of the mosque, which in this case it doesn't matter because again, like in Damascus, the directionality is parallel. No, sorry, the naves run parallel to the facade, but the directionality is perpendicular, as you can see here with the mirab. Question was it hard to convert mosque into churches? No, because you just have to change orientation. We will talk about that when we talk about the Mosque of Cordoba, how the Mosque of Cordoba was transformed into the cathedral that it's nowadays, how the Cathedral of Sevilla was converted into a church, the Church of El Salvador, the mosque, the Great Mosque of Sevilla, which was not what the cathedral is, was El Salvador, or the Aljama Mosque, was converted into into a church, and then later on, because of structural problems, the hypostyle hall was demolished and converted into a church. Both, and then in Sevilla is when in El Salvador it was because there was a massive problem of foundations because the whole building was shrinking, and and then in Sevilla, it was basically that they decided to demolish the Almohad Mosque, which was very simple, didn't have any feature on it because you still can see the courtyard nowadays. And then it's when they decided to do as the legend says, that the brief that the bishop gave to the builders, to the master builders, was, let's do a building so big that those who see us will think that we are crazy. Hagamos una catedral tal y tan grande que aquellos que la vean nos tomen por locos. So let's do it so big that people think that we are crazy. And that's basically what they did. So, but it was easy in both sides to convert a church into a mosque and a mosque into a church, because you need to change the direction of praying. So in the case of a church, obviously the altar pieces are always facing east, and therefore when you convert it into a mosque, you will need to change the direction. Obviously, the direct consequence is that if you convert a mosque into a church straight away, the church will be your orientation won't necessarily be Mecca, will be south, might be Mecca, might be not. And then, I mean, but back then, when you were not having a very clear understanding of trigonometry and astronomy, it could be okay to have that, and you could also stay in a square building and then pray on the direction as you would do as a Muslim anywhere, wherever you are. And nowadays you just put your app. I have seen people in the Middle East, they have the app. Oh, boom, 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 boom. Where is Mecca? Boom, and then they put Mecca, and then they pray. They don't need to look anymore or figure out. I mean, I remember when I was a child, I was in Morocco, I was in Algeciras, you would see them figuring out, making like an angle with the sun, etc., moving their hands a little bit to figure out what the distance is. Nowadays, you have the app. So yeah, in general, it was relatively easy to convert, and we will see an example. We will see three examples in the later parts of this season. Mostly will be the Cathedral of Sevilla. Sorry, the Mosque of Cordoba, which was a magistral transformation. Ironically enough, I always make the joke that the Mosque of Cordoba would pass perfectly, passes all the filters of the Chart of Athens, because it makes a clear distinction between what it is old and what it is new, and that's in an harmonic way. But then, ironically enough, all the people who defend the Chart of Athens hate the cathedral, the Renaissance intervention on the Mosque of Cordoba, and would prefer back. So, to the previous slide with the tiny columns, are you talking about this one?
Testing. All right, cool. If we can go back a couple slides, I've noticed that there were extremely tiny columns.
This one?
Can't see the change in slides yet.
Okay.
A bit further back.
This one?
Oh no, not this one.
This one?
It's like with the central nave and whatnot, the one that they converted into a church.
You mean Damascus?
No. I think it's just two more slides behind. I think it's a very small columns.
Ah,
this
yes.
one. Yeah, this one.
This one, yes. No, I mean these columns are actually quite sturdy. And also think that the whole structure is all these bolts, they are not heavy bolts, they are like very, very light brick bolts. You see that the roof is built on top of them, because these brick bolts are basically two rows of bricks. We will talk about that in the future class. They were just building the nerves with brick and plaster. You have very, very short coffers to build them, and then you just put two rows of brick very quickly, get with plaster. So it's not a heavy structure at all. That's where you can have that lightness, and you can have that as well in the Mosque of Cordoba. This is despite looking heavy. I mean, it's heavy because the walls are thick, and the walls are thick to prevent any movement inside the light of the light structure.
Okay.
So no, it's quite sturdy, and once you are there, it feels light because it's light, but it doesn't feel like flimsy or weak. So now the next typology that we have is the so-called the elongated hall with lateral alcoves. And the name says all. It's a long hall with alcoves either side. And this would become a very popular feature because it allows a hierarchy within the space, because you have all the side spaces, and it can create different spatial configurations in a very easy way, open to a courtyard. And then you could have like intimate spaces here that could be easily closed with a curtain. If you're using the building perpendicular to the long wall, you can create intimate and secluded spaces on the side in more or less way. I mean, this one is more testimonial, but this one is very clear. No, the rooms are connected, but you can have a door and closed it. Actually, I mean, if you go to these rooms in the Alcazar of Sevilla, there is a door here. I mean, if you want to see this room, you need to go out. You need to see the room through this direction, not through this one. In others, it's completely closed. In others, it had disappeared, like you can see in here. That was initially. Oh, no, on this case, no. Sorry, in this case, that was never an entrance because the two ways of entering the Alcazar were these and these. So there was never an entrance here, but they still kept the bidirectionality of them. And then once you enter here, you have like again like a more intimate space. So this was like the bedroom within the bedroom, because this space was bedrooms. I think that Emperor Charles V got married here, and then here was his nuptial chamber. So which is basically means that the bed was placed here. But then, I mean, but this space is repeated in both sides. Now we have this room here and here is used both, is the alcove of both this one and this room. And this is the alcove of the courtyards. In this case, we have converted the long room into a courtyard. And then these other two ones, they become the long room, the alcoves of this other long room. And this is a cuba connected with the courtyard, which is still keeping the arcades as we were seeing from the basilical hall. So everything is coming into one single piece. And then at the same time, you see these other two elongated halls that are acting as alcoves of the cuba. So you see that there is a very rich complexity of spaces. And then here we have, again, in this case, it's a more conventional space. And this typology was already there in Roman Spain. You see a lot in the Roman Hispania. You see that in some buildings of the Visigoths, and buildings of course in the Asturian kingdom. So there was this idea already present in there. But I mean, you can see this is 14th century, so they have a time enough to pile up all the different combinations that initially you see in another way. And here, I mean, this slide should have been before, because here you can also see this is that previously all this configuration in Medina Sahara. You can see how we have the elongated hall with side alcoves as the vestibule of a basilical hall. Same here. We have the elongated room with side alcoves acting as the vestibule of the basilical hall, but as well, we have, again, on this side, we have two other elongated rooms connected. So we have two ways of connecting this room. We have this connection, and we have the connection in blue. And then at the same time, this basilical hall can act itself as a cuba. But it's a basilica. If it was a cuba, it wouldn't be covered. It wouldn't have columns. So again, I mean, this is all the sequence and layering of the spaces. And below, you have another collection of spaces within the city. You have this one, which is the Dar al-Mulk, which is supposed to be like the proper bedrooms of the Caliph. So you have this double connection, this double stacking of rooms, which you will see also as well in Alhambra, to the point in which Alhambra, these rooms will become a very long room. The walls will disappear, will be just pilaster, or even not pilaster, just an arch. And all that is the evolution of this typology. And you find them as well in other buildings, the Alcazar of Carmona, the Alcazar of Guadalajara, even in the Alcazar of Segovia, which is the building as we see now is fully Christian. Some of the spaces were taken as that. And I recall as well that in the old Royal Palace of Madrid, when it was still the Alcazar, there was an area, one of the very, very primitive areas, when it was the Muslim Alcazaba, they had one elongated room with side alcoves. The Alcazaba of Malaga has that as well. So we will see all that. I mean, I'm putting all this because this is an element that is going to repeat in all the buildings that we're going to see in Islamic Spain. That's why I wanted to have this lecture before, otherwise it might be a little confusing later on. And then we have the Alhambra. In the Alhambra, everything is multiplied by 10 million. All these spaces are like twice multiplied, and some of them, they are dissolved. Why? Because if we take a look here, obviously we have the Tower of Comares, which is a tower and a cuba. We have the courtyard of the lions. We have, I mean, the space in front of the courtyard of the Rayanes is an elongated hall which has lost its alcoves, but it still has like testimonial arches either side if they're not even if they're not shown in the plan. In this case, the basilical hall has completely disappeared on the side, but has been retained on the short sides, as opposed to what would happen in others. Probably it was more than likely this is part of the palace of Charles V that goes in this direction. It's a square, and then with a round courtyard. There was probably something there, but it was demolished to build the palace. And again, the palace of Charles V is another beautiful example of the implementation of the Chart of Athens. And then again, all the people who defend the Chart of Athens hate the palace of Charles V. So it was never about originality. It was always about implementing the modernist agenda over everything. No, it's like even if in the past people could do what they say and still keep the tradition, the important thing was break with the tradition. So, and then coming back to other rooms, I mean, we can see here, this is the so-called Hall of Justice that has done something very interesting. Because here we have, again, this is an elongated hall with two side alcoves, and there is a double hall, with the difference is that the alcoves are opening up perpendicular to the main room. And the reason is easy, because if you keep like a double wall, then you're not getting so much light. Well, here you're doing it. We have again two little cubas either side of the courtyard of the lions. We have again another cuba here, another cuba with side alcoves, and then we have another hall, and then we have another cuba. So you see that all the space, that's what they say, they are multiplying one and another. And even in here, we have a mini elongated hall with two alcoves either side that then are connecting with the other. So it's incredible. Once you start walking in the Alhambra and you arrive here, once you know all the sequence of the spaces, it's mind-blowing, not only because of the beauty of the muqarnas and all the decoration, which is super beautiful, but also the spatial configuration of the Alhambra. What the architects did there, it's remarkable. And it's not only about ornamentation. The fact that Alhambra is heavily ornated is almost secondary. I'm very much aware that I'm having a modernist approach to the Alhambra and what I'm saying, but this is because if you go to the Alhambra and take only the beautiful plaster panels, you haven't appreciated Alhambra. And this is something that, I mean, if you go to Alhambra, you need to appreciate the space. The decoration is beautiful, but the space, it is what you cannot get. The decoration you can buy, you can get a plaster artisan, and that's it. You can be a very rich sheikh in the Middle East and ask your plaster artisan to replicate a Nasrid plaster, amazing work. But you're not getting the rich spatial capacities of the Alhambra. That is very impossible. That's very difficult to replicate, starting with that we don't live anymore the way the Nasrids live. But it's incredible as a space. It's really, really, really remarkable, and you will see when we get there. We're coming to the end, and we were talking about the Cuba and the Nasrid lantern room. And I'm bringing this again because the Nasrid lantern room is a Cuba with the light coming from above. So it's quite fascinating, and I'm bringing a section here because they are very late in development. They appear in 15th century. They don't have much time to develop because very soon the Kingdom of Granada enters into a massive crisis during the whole 15th century. Is conquered by the Catholic kings. America is discovered. Their daughter Johanna marries Philip the Handsome, and they have Charles V, which all of a sudden Emperor of Germany, and then all of a sudden Granada loses its importance. With the Catholic kings, Granada was a very important city because it was the culmination of the Reconquista. So it was a very, very prominent city, and they would use it a lot. Charles V would use it, but because he had to fight everywhere, he couldn't enjoy. I mean, they built a massive palace in the Alhambra, maniorism before maniorism by Pedro Machuca, but then it was forgotten. That's why I always say that all the achievements of Alhambra, they fade. They don't have any influence in the later development of Spanish architecture, while the most of Cordoba, the Alcazar of Sevilla would still have, because they would still be used and would be used as tools, while the Alhambra would become like that fortress on the hill owned by the given to the Franciscan and to a military garrison, and nobody hardly going there because it was too far, and they were not worried because it was the old palace of the Nasrids, and they would be more interested on the chancellery and all the palaces built over the old Arab city. And with this, we have finalized our brief or not so brief review on the spatial typologies, the typologies and spaces in Western Islamic architecture, with an overview of typologies over the whole spectrum of Islamic architecture. And now is when I'm going to open the Pandora's I can you can unmute yourself now if you want. I think that you are all muted now, but you can unmute yourself whenever you ask all to unmute. So you can now unmute if you want and talk, because now we are on the time. If you have more questions, comments, anything, this is, as you know, is your time. We have a question here. Yeah, it was Philip. I mean, it was in Spanish, it was Felipe el Hermoso, because all of them, all the kings have always a nickname. And it was Felipe el Hermoso, and then the wife was Juana la Loca, Joanna the Crazy, because she was crazy for him. And yes, she became a bit mental unstable when he died. Or that's what history said, because apparently she was very capable, but it was in everyone's interest to keep her there. But the thing is that all of a sudden, in 1492, all this, if America hadn't been discovered, if Charles V hadn't been the boy born in 1500, if Miguel de la Paz, who was the one who was supposed to inherit, who was his cousin, was supposed to inherit the kingdom, hadn't died, the poor boy at 2 years old, if the first son Juan hadn't died in a lost in passion with his wife Marguerite of Austria, probably that would have been a bigger focus in Granada, and that would have been a much more focus on the spatial capability of the Alhambra implemented towards Spanish palaces and other buildings, but it wasn't. That would be part of a different story. Any questions, comments, things that you like, things that you would like to know more? You know that this is open to the program is open to change. I think that in the next one we are having, if I don't remember badly, we're having geometry and composition. So that's going to be a very interesting one. So we're going to be talking about how this architecture is composed, why this idea of the whimsical ornament, of the whimsical capricious architecture doesn't exist. There is a very heavy geometry behind, and it's important. But it's also with as all these issues with geometry, there is always its flaws, its theories, the ancient aliens of Islamic architecture, etc. No, and also the Islamic architecture has its own golden ratio. So I always joke that the most of Cordoba is so spatial that it has its own golden ratio, which is called proporción cordobesa, the Cordoba proportion. And we will talk about that in there. So if the golden ratio is absurd enough to be implemented into every single example of historic architecture, the Cordoba proportion is even more absurd than comparing the golden section with Donald Trump's haircut. But you will see that next week. Let's see comments here in the chat. I would like to know a little bit more the transition from the Almoravids to the Almohads. That will be soon. That will be on the 11th of April, Taifas, Almoravids, and Almohads. That will be after Easter. So we're going to have geometry and composition next session to celebrate our love for geometry, because it's on Valentine's. So that's what we're going to celebrate. That's the love that you have, the love of that mistress, so demanding mistress of this architecture. Then on the 28th of February, Day of Andalusia, we're going to have the Umayyads and the Abbasids, because you need to know all the precedents of the Umayyads and the Abbasids to understand what happens in Cordoba. especially the Humajets, but I'm putting both of them in one go because we will later will know how both of them work to see the evolution of later Muslim architecture. Then the 14th of March is the whole class for the Mosques of Cordoba, because 2 hours is not enough to talk about the whole history and how they did everything, how it's the need converted into art. Then we have the 28th of March. It will be completely for Madinat al-Sara, for the palatial city. Then 11th of April will be Taifas, Almoravids, and Almohads, will be all that transition of architecture. But Guillem, I already tell you the spoiler, is that the Taifas was a very luxurious architecture, because each of the small kingdoms that substitute the caliphate will try to surpass the luxury of the caliphate. And then the Almoravids would come with the idea of calming things down, coming back to the origins and simplifying things. So the Almoravids would do a very, very, very austere and simple architecture. Then the Almoravids would collapse. A second row of Taifas would come. They would be more corrupt and opulent, and that would annoy the Almohads. And the Almohads would become a bit more complex in terms of architecture. The Almoravids were still very simple. They were from much more southern Morocco, much more desert tribes becoming powerful, while the Almohads would be a much more sophisticated. And you will see that the Giralda, for example, in Sevilla is completely Almohad. So that's quite a remarkable. And then later on, the Nasrids would come. Nasrid would initially, they were the Marinids. They would come and build as well as the new Almohads, the new kids on the block, the new Almohads. But then once after 1212 and after the whole process, after basically the siege of Algeciras in 1348, which is what settles and freezes the border between the Christian kingdoms and Granada for 200 years, then the Nasrids go from, let's say, scruffy invaders to extremely sophisticated rulers. Why? Because they would control a very wealthy area of Spain, where they were still controlling a lot of agriculture, which was the source of wealth in the Middle Ages. They would still control trade, because through Malaga and Almeria, they would still trade with the whole Muslim Islamic Mediterranean, and therefore they would be happy to be left in peace and pay heavy tributes to the Spanish kingdoms, basically to Castile. So that meant that they were happy to pay tributes, and they were happy to spend the remainings in luxuries, which was mostly the Alhambra. So that was an additional layer of sophistication due to the wealth and prosperity that brought 200 years of stability after the failure of the siege of Algeciras in 1348. And we will talk about all that in that, because I mean it's quite interesting. So, did the Arabs, Moorids develop their own columns, or did they borrow the European ones? Not just columns, but everything. What percentage of the Islamic architecture is influenced by Europe? And then, I mean, Federico has very rightful answer. There are Western Roman influence, Eastern Roman influence, and original creations. The current debate amongst experts is whether Eastern Roman influence had reached the Iberian Peninsula before the Muslim invasion. That's a very interesting debate that Federico is mentioning, because the traditional historiography says that all that was there. I mean, there is a very interesting book called Stelas Discoideas in la Península Ibérica, which is like a steel disc in the Iberian Peninsula, steel as the tomb, as the grave in the Iberian Peninsula, that says that the horseshoe arch is part of a pre-Roman substrate, that the horseshoe arch was there in Spain before the Romans. And it's true that in many parts of Spain, you find graves, carved graves from pre-Roman times, that have something similar to horseshoe arches. But then the Visigoths start implementing the horseshoe arch when they arrived to Spain. The Visigoths were Nordic people. We don't know if they took it from the north, but there is a stave church in Norway that has a horseshoe arch in there. How that horseshoe arch came, if it was there from the pagan substrate and then came down and then the Visigoths took that idea down, or if it was a result of the Vikings plundering Islamic Spain and then using something fancy that they took from a book or from a box, it's a different debate. But just bear in mind, just to carry on with the question, that when they built the Mosque of Cordoba, the first extension has to be done using previous material because Abd Rahman doesn't have the money. Abd Rahman has just proclaimed himself emir. Abd Rahman is relying on the support of the local nobility. Probably they were not going to, and probably the nobility was still Christians or half Christian. So probably they were not very happy with the idea of him wanting to build a massive mosque in Cordoba. So he was a bit left on his own to do it. So what did he do? Like everyone else was doing on those times of the early Middle Ages. You take the columns from the ruins around. There are plenty of ruins from Roman times that are not used, and therefore they get all that. So all the capitals on the first accession of the Rahman, they are spoils. They're spoils taken from anywhere. Sometimes they say that they took it from Merida, but no, they were from Cordoba. Cordoba was a city as important as Merida. So, or Sevilla, no, there were plenty of stuff around Cordoba for the Rahman to do the mosque. Then, eventually, especially in the last extension, the extension by Alaken and the extension by the Rahman, they recarve capitals. They do again Corinthian capitals, proper Corinthian capitals, and then step by step you start seeing some Byzantine influences, all these trepanated capitals that you see in Byzantine architecture, and then those trepanated capitals, I'm going to show you a little bit what I mean with the trepanated capitals. No, it's not here. Well, you can see a little bit all this very heavy, deep carving already in these Umayyad palaces, which was constant as well in the Byzantine Empire. But also, for example, all these capitals, these capitals that you see here, I mean, they are reconstructions, but these capitals are this is basically composite capitals, but carved ex professo for Medinat al-Sara. The bases of the columns have been carved ex professo, but they are a variation of the Attic base. So they took in Medina Sahara is easy to document because it was like done in a very short period of time. So all this architecture, I mean, all you see that these capitals are all the same because Rafael Manzano Martos, when he was doing the excavation, he found half a capital in the in the in the Dar al Junt. He found half a capital, and then with that half a capital, he did plaster cast and cement cast of all the capitals. So that's why all the capitals, when you see the reconstructed Medina Sahara, they almost look the same. Some of them are reproduction of others, but it's basically all that. And then there is a distinction. Religious architecture would become simplified. There would be so much carving. The columns in Islamic religious architecture in Spain, they don't have a base, but the civil architecture will have base and ornated capitals. And all that, and we will see much more on that when we see Cordoba, it's all heavily inspired in the Roman or even Visigoth and Roman substrate. Let's not dive into the previous one. Let's not dive into anything pre-Roman, just because it's more difficult to document. But yeah, there is that pre-Roman substrate present. There's this pre-Arab, pre-Islamic substrate, which in the case of the Iberian Peninsula means that. Now, as Federico is pointing out, all these influences, because eventually the Caliphate of Cordoba, the emirate becomes caliphate and becomes a very powerful state, then the successors of Abd Rahman will still be Umayyads, but then would be able to relate with to have diplomatic relationship with the Abbasids and the Byzantine Empire. So what happens is that certain things, they would come from the Byzantine Empire. For example, the mosaics in the mihrab of the mosque. But others, it's difficult to know if it was just a local tradition developing on its own, and which was the level of relationship with Byzantines. Because also, just to make things more complicated, the south of Spain was occupied by the Byzantines during 5th and part of the 6th century. So there was a Byzantine substrate from 100 years before that was happening there, plus whatever was happening with trade, etc., before the Arabs came. So the situation is is very larger and interestingly layered. But at the end of the day, what you need to keep in mind is that yes, to answer your question shortly, yes, there is a heavy Roman substrate. This is not, and I always make the same joke. This is not an Arab guy who was one day and tell Habibi, let's build the mosque of Cordoba, and then the two Habibis build the mosque. This is not two mates building a mosque. No, this is people who knew very well what they were doing, and there was there was like a industry, there was like a workshop, there was a guild hall, there was a very well organized system of master builders, master carvers working under a same scheme. So meaning that there was someone who knew about that supervising everything. So there was probably a master builder in Medina Sahara, the same way that were master builders in other places. Probably the tracing of the general ideas would have been done by some very important people in the court. I mean, but the same way, but to which extent it was properly tracing, you could make an analogy. I mean, in the Middle Ages, the bishop would come and say, the church, the cathedral must have 3 naves because of the 3 people of the Holy Trinity. It must have 12 arches for the 12 apostles, and so on and so on. And then the master builder will do the same. And it has to be a square because the square is 2 by 2 and it's 4 and blah blah blah. And it's like the four virtues. So all would have a symbol, but then I mean the proper geometry, the proper tracing would be done by a specialist, which is a bit like the relationship between the client and the architect nowadays. And to answer your other question, we will see the Fatimids in autumn. And then your last question, the horseshoe arch being Roman in influence isn't far-fetched, to be honest. Why is it? But no, the horseshoe arch is not Roman. The horseshoe arch has appeared several times in history. You can see in the Levant from time to time, pre-Roman, pre-Greek, pre-Hellenistic. It's there. You see a lot in pre-Roman Spain, in tombs, in graves, disappears during Roman times, and it appears again during Visigoth time. So, and by Visigoth time, I mean after the fall of the Roman Empire, Spain is invaded, Hispania is invaded by the Visigoths, which are barbarians coming from Northern Europe, and they settle there and they become the rulers. And then the horseshoe arch appears again in their construction. All the buildings of by the Visigoths, they hardly have half-rounded arches, they have horseshoe arches, not as pronunciated as the Islamic ones, but they are there. So did all of a sudden the absence of a Roman rule make by any sort of magic something that might be considered by the Romans, by the educated Romans as something of bad taste, something popular, be promoted by the Visigoths? Because maybe the Visigoths were Arians, they were not Catholics. Maybe the people who were doing the horseshoe arches were pagans, and they were barely the enemies of my enemies are my allies. We don't know. Maybe they were bringing their own tradition from Northern Europe of horseshoe arches for whatever reason, and you could find analogies on that. Or they just wanted to differentiate from the Romans, and they started to build the horseshoe arches. The truth is that by the time, or better said, the truth is that when the Umayyads arrived to Syria, 200 years before they invaded Spain, there are no horseshoe arches there. They are half-round arches. Sometimes a little bit elevated half-round arches, arcoperaltados, we would say in Spanish, but that's it. Then the pointed arch would eventually appear, but the pointed arch also appears in Islamic Spain with no influence at all, and we will see that when we talk about the Mosque of Cordoba, because it was a problem of setting out the arches in the extension of Bayal Mansor, and then he created that builder created without realizing the pointed arch. Does that pointed arch have a structural function? No, because it's the lower arch, so it just have giving a little bit of rigidity, and that's it. Thank you very much. Bye. So it's a bit of an interesting debate because, as Federico is saying, I mean, the horseshoe arch was there. Was there a horseshoe arch as well in the Levant? And then that was why Abd-Rahman was happy. Had Abd-Rahman had to deal with whatever the architect had to put on him because he didn't have much of a choice. That we don't know, and that we never know. But that is why there is this debate, especially I think that you find that debate more in Anglo-Saxon sources than in proper European Mediterranean, because it's very clear the distances and the difference. And Federico, correct me if I am wrong, please. But in Anglo-Saxon thing, people get too overexcited with things, and sometimes they start writing things starting with B and ending with HIT, bull, and ending in HIT. And if I say the full word, you know that YouTube is going to tell me, is going to penalize the video. So that's why I'm not saying it will have the bull asterisk HIT. So you have that. You have that a lot in Anglo-Saxon bibliography. But yeah, they create a very beautiful narrative, etc. And we will be talking when we talk about Alhambra, how the vision of the Alhambra that the world has is Washington Irving plus Owen Jones, whilst at the same time ignoring 300 years of magnificent restoration and research done in Spain. But yeah, I mean, did you get the whole thing, Amar, of the horseshoe arch and the pre-Roman substrate and the influences? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Absolutely, yeah. It's very
Excellent.
interesting to see how one question can like open maybe 10 different questions. I was going to ask them, but I felt like, maybe someone else wants to ask a question. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, any more question? I mean, you can ask as much questions as you want, Amar. You know that you're always very more than welcome to ask questions, and I thought it could be interesting because we will be talking about that. We will be talking about what did Abderrahman found when he arrived to Spain. What did they give him? So all that is very interesting, because then 200 years when Abderrahman III creates Medina Sahara, he doesn't have the struggles that his ancestor had when he arrived. He was a proper settled ruler. And when 100 years after Medina Sahara, Al-Manthur, which was like the prime minister or the equivalent, the vizier, decides to extend the Mosque of Cordoba on his own, he is ready to standardize the elements. And it's when it probably is the first time you can talk about, we can call it that, an order of Islamic architecture, which is we would say the pseudo composite order of Al Mansur in the Mosque of Cordoba, or these composite capitals in Medina Sahara. They are also, I mean, that because they predate Al Mansur. So this would be the first attempt on creating an Islamic order of architecture. But then again, it's fully classical.
Another question I had was during the lecture, you mentioned that one of the mosques, I think, is to Cordoba, the one that's not facing Mecca, or at least completely facing east.
Yes.
How's that the case? Isn't like literally Islam 101, point your mosque towards the Kaaba, or the Qibla.
Yes. Yeah, but I mean, how do you find the Qibla? Because you know what it is, because where you are, you always know what Mecca is. But imagine that all of a sudden you get a plane and then you get to London without a mobile phone, without a compass. What do you know
Okay.
that the Qibla is? Especially because you might think that what direction is it? So imagine back then that you couldn't figure out how. You also come, as Abderrahman was coming from an area where he was praying facing south, literally south. Why? Because Damascus is almost pointing south of Mecca, slightly southeast, but it's, I would say, mostly south. Then he goes to Cordoba. Then he has several decisions to make. The place where he's going to build the mosque is facing a cliff, which has to be oriented south. Period. Then he's also coming from the south. He has come from the Strait of Gibraltar. He's also comes from from traditionally he was praying toward the south. So scholars believe that there was also a political reason why he kept the orientation. Obviously, you had like the more immediate reason is that the Bishop Palace of Cordoba was there, what the mosque is now. There was a massive basilica there, because I mean they excavated, and when you go to the mosque of Cordoba nowadays, you can see on a little area under the ground, you can see the foundations of the Christian basilica. So it was adamant for Abderrahman to do the mosque there. Why? Because he was the new ruler. He needed to impose over that, the same way that his ancestor did in the Mosque of Damascus. So it was the logical conclusion. So then when he does that, I mean, he finds the problem that because of foundation, structure, etc., he needs to keep the orientation south. So then probably he said, I don't have a problem. I come from the south, my family prays south, and that's how the Umayyads do. That's the Umayyad way. So this is the most believed theory, that there were like two different facts that just overlapped, underpinned each other. And then
Interesting.
because of the importance of the Mosque of Cordoba, then all the other mosques would continue facing south, except in those two ones, probably because in the Mosque of Medina Sahara, they had obviously trigonometry was very much advanced. They had the terrain because it's in a very flat area within the whole slope, and then they probably decided to do the things right in there because it was the palatial town, etc. There was always the tension between the opulence of the court and the austerity that you're supposed to have, blah blah blah, as a ruler. And then the last one in the Partal in Granada was probably same situation. It was a small oratory, so there was no problem in orienting it as it should be. But I think that the problem was probably, as everything in the Mosque of Cordoba, that non-related condition shaped the development of the future architecture. And we will see more of them. I mean, it's like the lack of, for example, the lack of available columns of sufficient height would force Abdurrahman to have the double layering of arches if he wanted to reach similar height that what he had in Damascus. Why? Because in Damascus we had massive shafts. You didn't have that in Spain, so you had to reshape the idea. There was an earthquake, and half of the facade, the front facade of the Mosque of Cordoba was demolished, and they had to put a double facade. And because the columns wasn't fitting anymore, they had to put one column on one side, one column on the other, and then that became a feature in the whole Islamic architecture. You find it in the Alhambra. For no reason, you have those two columns completely stylized, converted into like two very thin sticks, mostly. Why? But that's what that's the way it kept working. I think it was probably Federico was probably the Almoravids. I think it was more. I see more the Almoravids doing that than the Almohads. Although actually no, I mean the Almohads were more powerful. Probably the Almohads. And another that I'm thinking is that the Almoravids were more radical, but the Almohads were more powerful. They had more money. So I would say that the Almohads were the ones, and that's probably one of the reasons why we don't have many. I mean, obviously because of the conquest, etc. I mean, the most would be converted into churches, but yeah, that's probably the reason. I mean, and then that makes sense in the sense that yeah, because of the Umayyad tradition, they do all them south, and then the Almohads and the Almoravids reorient them, and then obviously in Christian times, a lot of the small ones would be destroyed. The minarets would be retained, converted into belfries. But that's it. I mean, we still have many. I mean, more than Portugal. Portugal has only one, the Mosque of Mértola. That's the only Islamic remaining in Portugal, and it's a little mosque in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a beautiful Portuguese villa in Mértola. It's not like others, but that's a bit the whole influence. More questions? Yes.
I had a concern regarding, let's say, invasion. Usually, when someone, let's say, the Arabs, when they invaded Syria, they managed to, accumulate quite a lot of wealth, seeing that Syria was on the crossroads of, different empires, Africa, Europe, and Asia, and they managed to build very beautifully with huge columns from influence from the Byzantine and whatnot. How come Spain, known for its silver, and I think a bit of, I'm not sure about the gold actually, but I think they're known for silver. Uh, was there no wealth to be able to at least imagine if you're the caliph, you own almost all of Spain. I'm sure you can find a couple mines here and there to get maybe local artisans to come, or even like people from, let's say, North Africa to come. The idea that there was a shortage of columns to me sounds a bit hard to believe. I don't know. Is that something a valid concern to have?
No, I mean, there was not exactly a shortage of columns. There was a lot. On the contrary, there was a lot of columns that you could reuse from ruins. That's probably one of the reasons why they didn't go to carve bigger columns. But also to carve bigger columns, you need to know how to carve a big column, because it's more difficult, because it can break, and then you have to screw thing up if you break a massive column. And also you need to transport them, which is not easy at all in a so accidental country as Spain, such hilly country. So things like that were probably the reasons why you don't have monolithic columns as you have in Syria and the Levant, because there is an architectural tradition from Hellenistic times and before to have massive columns. Actually, the biggest column shafts in the world, they're in Lebanon, they're in Baalbek, and you have one still that was going to be supposed to be majestic, is still there and carved. So you have that columns. I mean, I think that basically what happened is that at the moment when Abdurrahman wants to build, and that's what I have been reading from all the scholars, when the moment that Abdurrahman wants to build the mosque, he's not in his most powerful moment. He doesn't have the money to pay for that, and he needs to. I mean, and as anyone else would do in his situation, he reused the materials that he had, because why would you carve columns when you have already columns there? So, and if he had enough, and his people, his builders, came with a solution, which they actually did, then there was no need, because probably for him the most important thing was to get similar height than Damascus, not to get a massive height. And now, if we analyze Roman buildings with massive columns, there are not so many. And again, I mean, if you only have, because I'm thinking, I mean, there is a Roman temple in Cordoba that has massive column shafts, but I think there are only 10 or so. And then you say, okay, I don't know, I mean, I can't remember. Let's quickly count how many columns he needed for the first extension. Let's quickly check. Yeah, so for the first extension, which is this one, oops. You have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. So you have around 120, 130 columns for that. If you if the only big massive column shaft that you have in Cordoba are 12, and you have already, because he managed to get the 130 columns for the first extension, then you just get the 130 columns that are already carved, and then you just get all the capitals that are already there, because in the first extension, some of the capitals are chopped. So meaning that he was getting everything from ruins. I was just chopping things just to make them work, to make them align. So that's the reason, and there are not so many columns. I mean, I'm putting you another example. In Sevilla, there was a temple. You still can visit the temple, the columns of the temple in Marmoles Street. It was supposed to be a temple to Hercules, and it was Corinthian columns in granite. So they brought them from God knows where, because it's gray granite. So they brought them from very, very inside Spain. Massively tall columns, and there were 6. So in 14th century, they decide the king of Castile, Pedro I, decides to take all the 6 columns and put them in the facade of the Alcazar. The street of Sevilla is super narrow. So I don't know how they manage to get the column. They basically believe, because in the 16th century they tried again, and they took them standing. So imagine taking a massive column shaft standing over super narrow streets, super dangerous. And the legend says that when they arrived to the courtyard in front of the Alcazar, where they were lying down the column, because it was easy to transport horizontally, the column fall down and break. Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, they didn't use aliens this time, because the column break. If they had, the aliens were used in 16th century. So, and then Peter the First, who was called Peter the Cruel, I think that he had a go with the poor people. there. But then, as you very have rightly pointed, Amar, in 16th century, they had alien technology, and they moved two of those columns to to what it is now the Alameda of Hercules, to a square to the north of Sevilla. And they did the same. But I mean, what I'm telling you is just to move two columns, it was a massive thing to do. Imagine to have to move 134 columns to put there. Forget about that, especially considering you already have the other columns. So it's not saying that you need to carve them. You already have them. And then said that, what happens? That then they need to get those when they do the next extensions, they just have the height of the columns already done. They're not going to change the style. They're going to continue the style, because the whole idea of the extensions of the mosque was to continue. It was like a family entrepreneur, was a family endeavor. So they were continuing that. And then when in 11th century, Almanzor does the extension to the west, what he's pointing out is that he's now more powerful than the Umayyads, and he continues the extension in the same style. So there was a sort of, you could call it unity of style in there. And then because it also settled the example, all future mosque and structure would follow the same idea of sort of relatively low, short columns, and then arches one on top of the other. So I think that's a bit the whole thing. It's, again, I mean, it's different layers, one on top of the others. It's not that you didn't have the stone. It's not that you didn't have the capacity to do the stone. It's that you had other elements there for you to help. And probably, I mean, at that moment in the 1656, in 756, he didn't have enough money and enough support to do something much bigger, something that his ancestors in Damascus did, because the columns that are in the mosque of Damascus are reused columns from the Temple of Jupiter and the Christian Basilica. Is that they didn't carve the columns, or if they have to carve, they had enough columns around. So that's what you need to bear in mind. So that a lot of the buildings in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, they are reusing a lot of Roman ruins, a lot of Roman elements, Roman spoil, because they are there for you to use, because nobody's using them. Another point, if you go to Rome and you see the temple of Antonino and Faustina, you see that the columns that have some marks on the top, because they were trying to turn them down with oxes and they were not able. So they were trying for so long that the column got a mark on that. And we're talking about Rome, where you have millions of columns and you couldn't use them. So you have to consider all those facts one on top of the other. It's not only that they couldn't do it, it's that they didn't want to.
Are the domes of these I mean, here we call it qibba. It just means hat. Qibba means hat. So you guys call it kuba? Cuba. So for the Cubas, was it like, see, some countries they do it, let's say double shell, and others they do it like a single shell, excuse me. And then I've seen one, I think it's for Florence, the Duomo del Fiori. It has like two shells, but the middle is like ultra support with beams everywhere. So how complex was let's say, the domes? I mean, we know that
Very
with
simple.
the ornamentation,
Very simple.
the ornamentation was very complex. But did they
Yes.
have like double shells, triple shells?
Yeah, it wasn't double shell. Like, I mean, the Dome of Florence has a double shell because you have to cover a massive space, and they didn't know how to do it. And then Brunelleschi comes up with that idea after looking similar Roman vaults of a slightly smaller distance, like the Temple of Minerva Medica. In Cordoba, they didn't have that problem because they are very small domes. So the way they were doing is that they would do the arch first, and then they would do they would put all the bricks fixed with plaster, with gypsum plaster, so it hardens very quickly. So you have your arch built here, and then on top of that you do 2 rows of brick. So meaning that you put one set of bricks with plaster, with gypsum plaster so that by the time you have put your last brick, the bolt is already resistant, and then you put another layer of brick with gypsum plaster. That is enough to then put the roof on top, because then you would use like a filling, like a padding, in Spain alcatifa, of earth, of rammed earth, and then on top you would build the roof. So, and that is enough. And still nowadays, especially in that way, that technique has survived, and it's called nowadays bóveda catalana. And in Catalonia is when you see those videos of the guy doing a spiral staircase with 2 layers of brick, super quick, and then he starts climbing on it. Doesn't fall at all, because that's the technique. Because the mortar that they're using, the secret is not the brick. The secret is the mortar. They're using gypsum mortar that hardens very quickly, but because hardens very quickly, you have to be quicker than the mortar to keep building. So that's what the skill is, in building the shape quicker, before the mortar hardens, which is very quick. So you need to be super quick in doing it. And usually they don't need a scaffolding. They don't need like a framework or a coffer to be built.
Interesting.
But that problem is Brunelleschi couldn't have done the dome of the Fiori with Bóveda Catalana. Same way that Gaudí couldn't do the Sagrada Familia with Bóveda Catalana, because Bóveda Catalana worked for relatively small structures.
You know, now that you mentioned Gaudi, I was thinking just the other day, I was just scrolling on my Instagram looking for something about Spain. I was looking for Medinat Zahra. Out of nowhere, I saw Gaudi's work. Excuse me, what's the name again? The one in Barcelona, the big one?
Sagrada Familia, the Sacred Family.
So, yeah, the Sacred Family. I don't really get it. Really, I don't. And then I looked him up, Gaudi. I looked up all of his work. I didn't really get it. I didn't see like any, let's say, classical language. All I understood was this might be somewhere around Art Deco. I just felt Art Deco too a bit, Art Nouveau.
No, I mean, Gaudí is not Gaudí. If Gaudí is something, if Gaudí is something other than Gaudí, it would be Art Nouveau. In Catalonian, Modernisme. Or in Spanish as well, Modernismo, because in Spanish, Modernismo means Art Nouveau, which has a completely layer of confusion when you translate directly, when we have all these debates and Spanish readers. And I think that Portuguese as well. Modernismo means Art Nouveau. And then, I mean, when you have all this modernismo, people think that if they are not much into the field, they think that you are criticizing Art Nouveau. I have had people who have come to me saying, "Oh, I have read Leon Crier's Architecture of Community in Spanish, and I don't know why he's against modernism. Why does he don't like Gaudí?" And it's because when they translated it into Spanish, they decided to keep the definition of modernismo as modern, not the Art Nouveau, which is actually, when you go to the Spanish dictionary, I think is the third or the fourth definition of modernismo is what we call in Spain movimiento moderno. So in Spain we have.
Wait, so in Spain, you guys refer to Art Nouveau as modern? Modernismo.
Modernism in Spain. Modernismo.
Okay, then what's the current, let's say, this mess that we have right now? What is this mess called right now?
No, because in English, you have modernism is like the modern architecture, Le Corbusier, etc. Not so people, when you read in Spanish a direct translation from English, and they use modernism to refer to modern architecture, most of the Spanish people, when they read the word modernism, because it's what we see everywhere in the country, in the textbooks, in history books, of course, when you go to Barcelona, but not only Barcelona, because modern you have Art Nouveau everywhere in Spain. People call that modernismo because that's what the modern shapes that they were using at the beginning of 20th century. And then, because when proper modern architecture arrives, the term modernism was already there, so they couldn't use it. So they started calling it movimiento moderno, the modern movement.
Oh.
So that
Okay.
is why in Spain
Interesting.
we have those two terms. And now, I mean, obviously, because we use English and you tend to translate literally from English those words that are easy to translate. And we never wanted to use the French word Art Nouveau. That is the issue that many people find when they read a book that goes against modernismo. They think that it's against Gaudí and all the
So
architecture.
does Gaudi count as, let's say, a classical, let's say, does he fall under the classical umbrella or is he something else completely?
Gaudí is Gaudí, in the sense that I mean
Interesting.
it's difficult. I mean he's unclassificable. I would say. It's like there was a singer in Spain called Lola Flores who went to New York, and the New York Times put a critique, the review on her actuation. She said she doesn't know how to sing, she doesn't know how to dance. Don't miss her. So it's like it breaks all the schemes, but it's still
Yeah.
great. So I would say that's a bit how Gaudi is. It's you could call him art and craft architect if you want to be. If Gaudi was something that was outside himself, that would be an art and craft architect. The same way that to me, Frank Lloyd Wright was not a modernist. Frank Lloyd Wright was an art and craft architect. While Le Corbusier, Mies, etc., they were beyond that. But Wright
Yeah.
was very art and craft. Was probably I sometimes refer to him as the last art and craft architect, because even to the last one, I mean, probably not the Guggenheim in New York, but the Johnson factory is it's an art and craft building.
Frank Lloyd Wright. I have some opinions about them. Well, not really opinions. It's more like I've seen some studies that say his buildings are extremely, extremely leaky, especially that one next to the river. The one next to the river, apparently, it has within 40 years, it has surpassed. I think Dr. Burrs told me this. The construction has surpassed 6 times. So now the maintenance costs 6 times the construction, which is
Yes,
insane
yeah,
within 40 years. And
yeah,
that's insane. It's
but
absolutely insane.
that's a waterfall house, so that was a problem since the very beginning of the conception of the house. So I mean, and there are there are lots of art and craft houses which are very badly built, but the philosophy that Wright had, I mean, which is at the end, because sometimes they put them within the modernists, but I don't think, I mean, he was too diva to be part of something. It was a bit like Gaudí, no? It was like too much of a extremely individualistic genius to be classified onto something. And well, Gaudí they would tell, oh, you are Art Nouveau. Gaudí wouldn't care. He would carry on doing his designs. Frank Lloyd Wright, probably because of his personality, would be more, no, 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 I am me. I am Frank Lloyd Wright. I am not part of anything. So it was different personalities. No, Gaudí was more the monk designer, because that was more a lot how he was. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright was much more conscious of his public figure, etc. Remember that Gaudí dies because he left. He went to church, and he was so scruffy that, I mean, he was crossing the road, a tram hit him, and when people saw him, they thought that he was like a beggar. So they took him to a hospice, beggar's hospice, and then it only after 2 3 days is when they started looking for him. Why? Because Gaudí used to spend days, entire days, in his cubicle within the Sagrada Familia. He had like a little
Mm.
cubicle where he was drawing, doing his experiments, doing his stuff, and he wouldn't leave from days from that cubicle. So that's why none of the apprentices, none of the builders in the Sagrada Familia just miss him. Oh, yeah, he must be there. And then when they realize after 3 days he's not there, where he is, they started to find him, and then when they found him, it was that they couldn't do anything. But yeah, it was because
My last my last question for you is in regards to Art Deco. And when I was reading Dr. Nur's book, him and the Community of Architecture by Leon Creer, both of them have a point where if something is too big, it becomes somewhat dystopian. But I've been checking out these Chicago skyscrapers, like the ones built before the modernism stuff. Wow, they're very beautiful. And I wonder, like, doesn't that go against whatever the CPI advocates for, that having skyscrapers isn't the most, let's say, holistic thing, but they can look good. Like, what do they call that one in New York?
Well, I mean, I think that the problem of the skyscraper is that they require a lot of energy to operate. So because it's not only because people think the lift. No, the lift is the least of the problems. It's the water. You need to pump
Yeah.
all that water
The
up to
pumps.
the pumps because it's not that you turn it's not that you turn off your it's not like I mean when you live in a normal building, you turn on your tap and you're working with the regular pressure with the normally by normal pressure you can get up to a fourth floor, which has been like that since Roman times. So that's natural pressure of the water. If you do things properly, and everyone does it properly when they started to set up all the water systems, they always do to ensure that you have 3, 4th floor natural water pressure without any problem. Now, if you need more, you need to pump all that water up to the top of the building so that then can go through natural pressure below. Problem. If you do that in a 10-story building, there is not much of a problem. If you do that in a 30-story building, the water at the bottom comes with a massive pressure. So you need to create ways of calming that pressure. That's one. The lift is also a problem.
Yeah.
The more you have to go, electricity, AC, because you cannot keep your windows open all the time in a skyscraper. And more of the problems, it comes that the cost of operating and building them, it has an impact on the climate, and it's not so efficient, etc. And then we entered into the cycle of trying to solve problems created with technology, with more technology, while the solution would have been not to use that technology in the first place. And then we have problems of high density, community not being formed or nourished in a tall building, because that's what happens in tall buildings, etc. So that's why. I mean, they can be beautiful. They can be beautiful, but obviously, if they're beautiful, they are less impactful. But I think that's the whole problem, especially around both Krier and Dr. Buras and Creator Street and many others. They're advocates of the gentle density, which means like traditional gentle density, like from 4 stories, maybe 6 or 7, which you can find in some parts of Haussmannian Paris because you need it because of the speculation. But all this architecture before the fanciness of the skyscraper. And also, when you build a skyscraper, why do you need them? Which is also something that you need to wonder. Obviously, I mean, as an architect, if your client wants a skyscraper, you need to give what your client wants to. But a planner would consider, why do I need a skyscraper? I mean, and the planner would plan a skyscraper because the politician tells them that they want a skyscraper. Why does the politician want a skyscraper? Because a skyscraper are very appealing because it makes you think, oh, it's like New York. It's like London doesn't need a skyscraper. And they keep building and building and building and building and building tall buildings that are empty. And the Shard is still half empty. Canary Wharf is still half empty. And they keep doing skyscrapers in the city, which was the first reason why they built Canary Wharf, so that the city they didn't have to build skyscrapers in the city. And now they have totally destroyed the skyline of London, which was always dominated by St. Paul. Now it's dominated by the cheese grater and the walkie-talkie and the gherkin.
It's crazy. It's just crazy. Yeah, what a silly name for skyscrapers. Yeah.
Correct, but I think that but then you say, why did they build them in Chicago? Because Chicago needed them, and they didn't have much space, and they were still working on a sort of traditional environment without big nodes of public transport, etc. They started doing it, and the skyscraper of Chicago, they are not the massive ones. Then in New York, you have a different situation because you don't have a space. So
Interesting.
you need to go up. But for example, if you go to the west coast of the United States, you go to Los Angeles, which is the urban sprawl by excellence, you don't have a skyscraper. They built one because for the Olympics, I think it was the Olympics I don't remember. It was Los Angeles 1984, and then it was Seoul 1988. Or Seoul 1988, Los Angeles 1994. And if not, someone can correct me in the comments or anything, so please do. And then, I mean, apparently, I mean, the only skyscraper that Los Angeles had by then was done just to publicize that it was an American city and that people, the Olympic Committee, was a bit strange that Los Angeles didn't have skyscrapers because they had the image of New York. But you go to Washington, doesn't have many. You go to Paris, doesn't have many. Everyone hates Torre Montparnasse. So you go to Milan, and everyone hates Torre Velasca. So it's because it was an attempt to do something that worked very well in New York, and then everyone wanted to imitate without much need to do so. So yeah, that's my intake on skyscrapers.
Can I say something?
Of course you can.
Oh, how are you, everyone?
I am very good.
Um, this argument about skyscrapers, I'm having this argument with Armenian architects because in Yerevan, recently, for recent years, um the developer started to build the bigger and bigger buildings. And when I mentioned that this is not good for environment, also for traffic jams, or also for this infrastructure, because the infrastructure was not meant to be built this for this building this height. Recently, we started to notice the sewage waters are coming out from this. I don't know how to say it in English. You understand? Maybe. And everybody is saying because the population is growing and we don't have enough space to populate everyone. And I always say this argument that LA County is 3 times smaller than Armenia, but the population is 10 million, and Armenia is 2.5 million. And in LA County, there are only the majority buildings are one-story residences. And this argument kills the argument of we need to build more bigger buildings in order to populate everyone. So that's it. And early skyscrapers, and everyone asks, how can you build classical skyscrapers if we need them? I always say that New York, early skyscrapers had classical ornaments and proportions, and classical architecture is so flexible that even can be used in skyscraper building if it's needed. I don't know. What do you think about all
I
this?
think that there is a very clear problem with,
Mm-hmm.
the problem doesn't come with the architect, the problem doesn't come with the planner, because here we're talking about aspirations.
Mm.
So the developer will build what he sees a demand on.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically, there is the political establishment
Mm-hmm.
that is blinded or guided or illuminated with the idea that
Uh-huh.
skyscrapers bring modernity. Period.
Mm.
Why? I don't know. But
Ah, yes.
a lot of politicians thinks that. And then it's like this idea that the country needs to be modernized, modernized, modernized. I guess that in the case of Armenia, it's just not to look like Soviet or whatever. In the case of Spain, it's not to look like Franco. In the case of UK, it's not to look like Thatcher or whatever it was before Thatcher or Blair or whoever. So and so on and so on. No, it's like all this running, kicking the can down the road that you find a lot. So I think that the problem is like, why is the skyscraper demanded? And none of the reasons you have given me is like a practical reason. No, it's all symbolic and aspirational reasons. No, you don't need one. And for example, in UK, this is something that it happened a lot with the Shard and with many others. It's like the skyscraper is too many people. We're going to liberate the space. Blah 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 blah. The skyscraper is there empty. Why? Because the owners have decided not to sell it and just to keep the prices high, speculate with that. So then why do you allow them to build? So they didn't fulfill the promise. And that's what's happening now. I mean, the very first row of skyscraper, they were doing that. Even the first modernist skyscrapers were doing that. But now it has become a game of speculation. So building skyscrapers nowadays is just another way of speculate. So that's why they're not solving any problem, but they're using. I wouldn't say money laundry. It's not. It doesn't have to go so deep. It's just pure speculation. So that's why that's in my opinion. That's that you have politicians that are like blinded or less like blatant with the idea that all these skyscrapers are going to bring prosperity and modernity and the idea of modernity. And sometimes people don't need modernity, they need the idea of modernity. They don't need, and sometimes modernity is brought by policies that ensure that you have a modern standard of life, not by forms of modern life, if you know what I mean. So modernity is, some people would argue that it's something different than just shiny skyscraper, but they're the easy part to show off a modernity. I think that that's a bit the point. And then and for a politician, it's very easy to say, "Oh, we are building the tallest skyscrapers of Erevan," and then in the next mandate, we're going to be another 10-story more because Erevan is very modern, and we want to be very modern because the Soviets didn't let us build anything modern. And then, even if it was not true, but that's what we do. And then you have to be more shiny than any Soviet concrete brutalist building. So now then all are glass because it's light. And Le Corbusier said 100 years ago that everything has to be light wearing, blah, blah, blah. So it's people who just have been sold a vision. It's a bit like the emperor, the tale of the emperor, no? The suit, the emperor suit, no? It's like everyone is still sees the emperor suit because if you don't see it, it's because you're silly. So then a lot of politicians enter into that. I'm not even blaming the politician. It's the discourse that has been implemented into modern societies, that it's the skies, those symbols, the skyscraper, the car, the sprawl, is symbols of the American way of life that are still very powerful symbols everywhere you go. And then also, as a byproduct, they are very good for speculators and things like that. So, but as I said, it's a byproduct. I mean, if there was not speculation, if there was not any dodgy businesses associated to it, it would still happen. It would still happen. So I remember in Sevilla, the mayor wanted to, there was a bank, local regional bank, that they wanted to have, they needed a new area. And then the mayor backed the idea of building a skyscraper for that bank. And between the reasons is that, why not? I mean, in the exhibition of 1992, for example, Santiago Calatrava wanted to build a massive bridge. And then he was stopped by the municipality and by the authorities saying that, no, your bridge cannot be taller than Giralda. Giralda is the icon of Sevilla. You cannot build it taller than that. No, but it's far of the protection area. We don't care. The Giralda is so tall that it's seen from everywhere in a lot of kilometers around. Your bridge is not going to compete with Giralda. He abided with the rules. But then with this one, I mean, and then all the aerial traffic was organized. And then Montessori wanted to say, no, we're doing it. I mean, we are in the early 2000s, we're in the new Spain, and we are building the modernity, blah, blah, blah. It was the roaring years at the beginning of 21st century in Spain. Everything has to be built new and bigger and shinier. And there was a massive real estate bubble, bars, ready to burst, but people kept feeding it. And then, I remember that I was still a student. And the debate was like, no, wanting to, why would you want to still keep the Giralda as the biggest building that's the tallest building in Sevilla? It has been the tallest building for 800 years. It's time to bring something else. We are not like retrograde people, like cavemen who want to stay like that for all time. We were in a democracy. And then all of a sudden, a lot of a discourse on democracy, freedom, values, modernity entered to compete with an icon. After a lot of debate and backing with the mayor, the skyscraper was built. 2 years later, the bank entered into bankruptcy. The tower is half empty nowadays. and it's there. You can
What
see
would
from
your opinion be?
you can see there
It's
from anybody
What
in
would
horrible.
Spain.
your
So why did you do that? Why do you have the Shard half empty? Why do you have West Point in Oxford Street is still half empty? Well, icons of modernity that failed, but they still kept them because if you tell them that they are that the emperor is naked, you are told that you're stupid. Sorry, you were going to say something, Aram. Sorry.
No, I was listening. Nothing.
Amar, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say the final thing before we conclude. My question was, you know how we have some places during the Italian Renaissance, like let's say in Florence with Giotto Tower, and even Florence and everywhere else. A lot of these cities had huge towers, Bologna, San Gimignano, Florence, I think a bit of Pisa and Parma too. So my question for you is, you know, they managed to make their towers look beautiful. Could we do the same thing? Let's say maybe differently,
I would
because
call the towers in Bologna beautiful. They were just defensive
you wouldn't think
towers.
so?
I mean, they are. I mean, they were defensive tower. They were not never meant to be ornamental. Giotto's tower in the Campanile of Santa Maria di Fiore is a different case. That's a different case.
Mm.
But the tower that you're mentioning is San Gimignano, Bologna. You have one in Lucca. All of them, they are defensive towers for the local families. They are not. They were never meant to be something ornate. They were a demonstration of power of the local families, pretty much like the skyscrapers are nowadays. So they have aged well, which you cannot say about the skyscrapers. But the objective of the government was always demolishing them. For example, there is a town in Spain called Madrigal de las Altas Torres, which the name would be Madrigal of the High Towers. The city doesn't have any tower at all. But in the Middle Ages, it was known as the city of the high towers because it was similar to Bologna. And the others, it wasn't so exaggerated, but there were 4 or 5 families that were having all the towers. And the Catholic kings, one of the first thing they did was chop down all the towers in Madrigal. So Madrigal de las Altas Torres is not anymore Altas Torres, but a high tower. But that's the thing. Same thing as the authorities started to do in Bologna. I think that as soon as the papacy took over Bologna in 16th century, the towers started to chop down. I think now you have 2 or 3, and the ones that are there, I mean, they are not. I mean, they are historical towers, but I wouldn't call them pretty tower. They don't have an ornamental purpose. They have a defensive and show off intimidation purpose. So the modernists use that to say, oh yeah, because San Gimignano has towers, we should all have towers. And well, now why all of a sudden you are a modernist, you hate history? Why all of a sudden you are taking out of nowhere San Gimignano to justify the skyscrapers? No, I mean, you were supposed to be against history. So it's one of these ironies of, I mean, modernists want that because they are obnubilated, they are like shined by, they want to build bigger modern glass and all that. So that's they would use anything to justify that. But said that, I mean, we have plenty of examples. You two have been mentioning Aram, and you have been mentioning the skyscrapers on the School of Chicago, which are very beautiful. They are all actually inspired, but the skyscrapers of Chicago are not inspired in the towers of San Gimignano. The skyscrapers are based. The models are the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the medieval Gothic belfries, the Giralda of Sevilla, and the Campanile of San Marcos. Those are the 4 main models on which and then of direct tall buildings of antiquity. And then the compositional model was the Italian Palazzo. Palazzo Farnese was the great model for all the skyscrapers, all the medium size, not the massive one, but you see that in McKinley and White, all the tall buildings that McKinley and White did. And the buildings in Yemen, yeah, you have made the exception that probably confirms the rule. I think that those buildings in Yemen are different because, as you say, they are part of an urban endeavor. They are not individual towers built for families to show off and defend. They're actually people living in those towers. But those pretty towers in Yemen, they are actually housing. The buildings the tower that you're telling me in Bologna, San Gimignano, they're defensive towers. That's why they have that difference. And they are not so tall. I mean, obviously, I mean, the towers in Yemen are massive, 10 stories. but that's a different situation. But that's why they are pretty, because they are an urban element, not just a defensive element. The Romans had similar things to those towers in Yemen. They were calling them insula. They were up to 10, 12 stories. And you see reference to them. I mean, imagine living in a 10-story building in a shack, as the Roman housing wasn't as good as you could imagine. So yeah, no, it was. But yeah, those skyscrapers in Yemen are very beautiful, and I encourage anyone who is interested in them to look for the Shibam, Shibam in Yemen. All those skyscrapers are very, very beautiful.
What about Campanile? Like, for example, when you go to Venice, you can see, for example, the
Yeah, the
Campanile
Campanile
di
of
San
San
Marco.
Marcos is one of the references for the modern skyscraper.
Nice. All right, cool. I think that answers all of my questions, actually. Yeah.
I'm thinking one day I should do. I mean, the thing is that one I do that's exclusive for the students at the CPA. We have one class dedicated only to design of skyscrapers.
Hmm. Do you guys have one for like all of Venice? Because I feel like Venice requires its own, not a
Wow.
semester, but maybe like its own episode, honestly.
Yeah, Venice needs several stuff too, because
Hmm.
Venice is the palaces, the type of churches, the theaters, the whole public buildings. Venice is interesting in that sense because as it was like on its own, it surrounded itself with a lot of admin buildings and state buildings that other countries didn't do. So all the Procuradurie, the Biblioteca Marciana, it was having a lot of civic life elements that other countries took more time to develop. I mean, I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, could come. I mean, obviously in England you have Somerset House in 18th century, the first proper office building as such, as office complex. In Sevilla you have end of 16th century, the Casa de Contratación, which is now the Archive of Indies. You have Simancas, but that was more of an archive. So those are the examples. But Beni had the Procuraduría, who was a proper government building before any other, probably since the Tabularium in Rome. At least that comes to my mind. Perfect, gentlemen. I think we can call it a day.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being here. I mean, I think that we have been here for 3 hours.
Mhm.
I wonder why YouTube, if YouTube doesn't cancel my videos of 3 hours. I'm still surprised that it can upload 3 hours of videos. But then, yeah, I mean, if you want to revisit any part of this, you will have it in YouTube uploaded in the next hours. And then for everyone watching the video till the end, thank you very much for staying till the end. And if you have comments, suggestions, etc., you can leave it on the comments. I think that now it's compulsory to say click like and subscribe, so please do. And I don't care if you click like or subscribe, to be honest. But yeah, if you have any comment, anything, you just can write. I mean, I wish I could be like the Aesthetic City and live out of YouTube, but it's not going to happen. So then one day, I think it will be easier than to win the lottery. Anyway, so thank you very much. I'll see you in the group. Questions that you have in the group, you ask them from there, and I see all of you in 2 weeks for the exciting class on geometry and composition in Islamic architecture. Until then, have a lovely rest of the day, a lovely rest of the weekend, a lovely beginning of the weekend, and see you soon.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much,
much.
Thank you.
Pablo.
Thank you,
Much appreciated.
Pablo.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you.
bye bye. Bye bye.
Pablo, I have a
Bye-bye.
lot of to I have something to tell, some stories to tell, but I leave you for next week.
Sure. If you
Some
want, if,
interesting stories.
excellent. So what we can do is that next time we
Mhm,
speak separately before the class, and then
mhm.
basically, I mean, we do it together. I mean, instead of me speaking for 2 hours, I shorten the presentation so that it's less, is shorter and more approachable. And then we talk. Maybe we just start first, and then it's me, so that people keep the interest. But then,
Ah,
I'm
yes.
sure I would be more than happy for you to present something on the salon, because it's, as I
Oh,
said,
yes, yes.
it's open for everyone.
There's a lot happened for in this past 2 weeks. I will tell you later.
Excellent. I will be more than happy to hear about it. I mean, and then you guys, you are
Yes.
listening in the recording, and stay tuned for in 2 weeks' time, because we're going to have Aram as a guest.
Mhm.
Until then, thank you very much and have a good rest of the
Thank you.
day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.